In the sleepy village of St. Mary Mead, a stranger's arrival stirs whispers of scandal. Who is Leonard Ashby, the charming yet secretive man at Willow Grange, and what hides behind his late-night visitors when a sapphire brooch vanishes and a coded scrap of paper surfaces? Miss Jane Marple's keen eyes spot the threads of a deeper crime. Why is Clara, his trembling secretary, hiding letters by the old well? What ties a lost heiress, a buried locket, and a threatening note to Ashby's past, with her secret weapon, her uncanny understanding of human nature? Miss Marple unravels a web of fraud, betrayal, and hidden rooms. Will she expose the truth before the shadows of Willow Grange claim another victim? Dive into a mystery where every glance holds a clue, and no secret stays buried for long. Chapter 1. The Whisper of Suspicion. The village of St. Mary Mead lay draped in the soft haze of an early autumn afternoon. Its thatched cottages and winding lanes bathed in the golden glow of a sun reluctant to set. The air carried the faint scent of damp leaves and wood smoke, a quiet promise of the season's turn. At the heart of the village, Mrs. Puddicombe's tea shop hummed with its usual rhythm, gentle clink of teacups, the low murmur of gossip, and the occasional burst of laughter that rippled like a pebble tossed into a still pond. It was here, in this unassuming haven of scones and secrets, that Miss Jane Marple sat, her knitting needles clicking softly, her eyes half hidden behind spectacles, absorbing every detail of the room like a sponge. Miss Marple's corner table, tucked beside a window framed with lace curtains, was her observatory. From this vantage point, she could see the comings and goings of St. Mary Mead's residents, their faces as familiar as the stitches in her latest shawl. Today, however, her attention was drawn to a new figure, a man named Leonard Ashby, who had arrived in the village 3 weeks prior and taken up residence at Willow Grange, the grand but slightly dilapidated manor on the edge of town. His arrival had sparked a flurry of speculation, for St. Mary Mead was not accustomed to strangers, especially those who kept to themselves with such deliberate care. Mrs. Puddicombe, bustling behind the counter with her apron dusted in flour, leaned toward Mrs. Hartley, the postmistress, her voice a conspiratorial whisper. "He's a queer one, that Mr. Ashby comes into the village only to buy his papers and tobacco, and not a word more than necessary. They say he's got visitors. At all hours carriages rolling up to Willow Grange past midnight." Mrs. Hartley, her lips pursed as if tasting something sour, nodded. "My Tom saw lights in the Grange's upper windows last night, flickering like they were hiding something. And that secretary of his, Miss Rennell, was looking like she's about to bolt." Miss Marple's needles paused just for a moment, as she registered the name, Clara Wren. The young woman had been seen trailing after Ashby like a shadow, her pale face and nervous hands marking her as someone carrying a burden. Miss Marple's mind, sharp as the scissors tucked in her knitting bag, began to weave connections. People, she had long observed, were like her knitting patterns, complex but predictable once you understood the threads. As if summoned by the gossip, the tea shop's bell jingled and Clara Wren stepped inside. She was a slight figure, older than 25, with mousy brown hair pinned tightly beneath a plain hat. Her grey coat was neatly pressed but threadbare at the cuffs, and her eyes darted about the room before settling on the counter. She approached Mrs. Puddicombe, her voice barely above a whisper as she ordered a pot of tea and a scone to take away. Miss Marple's gaze softened, but her mind was alert. Clara's hands trembled slightly as she fumbled with her purse, and a small, folded handkerchief slipped from her pocket, fluttering to the floor like a fallen leaf. It landed near Miss Marple's table, unnoticed by Clara, who collected her parcel and hurried out, the bell jingling in her wake. Miss Marple leaned forward, her movements deliberate but unhurried, and retrieved the handkerchief. It was fine linen, edged with delicate lace, and in one corner, embroidered in bold blue thread, were the initials L.A. She turned it over in her hands, her lips pursing thoughtfully. Leonard Ashby, perhaps. But why would Clara Wren carry his handkerchief? The initials could belong to someone else. Of course, Miss Marple never jumped to conclusions. But the coincidence was too neat to ignore. She tucked the handkerchief into her bag, her mind already spinning with possibilities. Clara's nervousness, the late-night visitors, the flickering lights at Willow Granget was all too much like the opening bars of a tune she had heard before. In her long experience, secrets were rarely solitary. They came in clusters, tangled, together like yarn left too long in a basket. The tea-shop conversation drifted to other matters, Mrs. Hartley's rheumatism, the vicar's latest sermon, but Miss Marple's attention remained on Clara Wren. She recalled seeing the young woman at the village fete a week ago, her face pale as she stood beside Ashby, who had been all charm and smiles, shaking hands with the local gentry. There had been something off about his manner. Miss Marple thought a polished ease that felt rehearsed, like an actor playing a part. Clara, by contrast, had seemed almost transparent, as if she wished to vanish into the crowd. As Miss Marple sipped her tea, the door opened again, admitting Mrs. Dolly Bantry, her cheeks flushed from the crisp air. Dolly was one of Miss Marple's oldest friends, a woman whose exuberance was matched only by her insatiable curiosity. She spotted Miss Marple at once and made a beeline for her table, plopping down with a rustle of tweed. "Jane, you'll never guess what I've heard," Dolly began, her voice carrying just enough to draw a few glances from nearby tables. "That Mr. Ashby is throwing a grand dinner at Willow Grange tomorrow night. The whole village elites invited Dr. Haydock, the Langleys, even that dreadful Mr. Gibbs from the bank, and me, of course." She beamed, clearly delighted by the prospect of a social event. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "A dinner, you say? How very illuminating." "Oh, it's more than that," Dolly continued, leaning closer. "They say he's got some sort of announcement to make. Something big. Mrs. Langley swears it's about his business ventures. But I think there's more to it. The man's got an air about him, Jane, like he's hiding something behind all that charm." Miss Marple nodded, her fingers resuming their knitting. "People often do, Dolly, and it's the ones who hide, at best, who bear watching." Dolly laughed, but her eyes narrowed. "You're up to something, aren't you? I know that look. You've already spotted something, haven't you?" Miss Marple's smile was serene. "I've merely found a handkerchief, Dolly, nothing more." But it was more, of course. That afternoon, as the sun dipped lower and the village settled into its evening quiet, Miss Marple walked the short distance to Rose Cottage, where Clara Wright lived with her widowed aunt, Mrs. Tuttle. The cottage was modest, its garden overgrown, with late-blooming roses that spilled over the fence. Miss Marple knocked gently, her expression one of kindly concern. Mrs. Tuttle answered, her face creasing with surprise. "Miss Marple, what brings you here?" "I believe Miss Wren dropped something at the tea-shop," Miss Marple said, producing the handkerchief. "I thought she might want it back." Mrs. Tuttle called for Clara, who appeared at the door, her eyes widening at the sight of the handkerchief. "Oh, thank you, Miss Marple," she stammered, her fingers brushing the fabric as if it burned. I I didn't realize I'd lost it." "It's no trouble at all," Miss Marple said, her voice gentle but her eyes sharp. "Such a pretty thing with those initials. L.A. a gift, perhaps." Clara's face paled, and she clutched the handkerchief tightly. "No, it's mine. I must have picked it up by mistake. Thank you." She stepped back, clearly eager. To end the conversation, Miss Marple smiled, undeterred. "I hear there's to be a dinner at Willow Grange tomorrow. Will you be attending, Miss Wren?" Clara hesitated, her eyes darting to the side. "Yes, I'll be there. Mr. Ashby needs me to help with the guests." "Of course," Miss Marple said. "I'm sure it will be a most interesting evening." As she walked back to her own cottage, Miss Marple's mind was alight with questions. Clara's fear was palpable, but it wasn't the fear of a thief or a conspirator, it was the fear of someone caught in a web not of their own making. The handkerchief, the initials, Ashby's secretive demeanor, the dinner, it all pointed to a mystery that was only just beginning to unravel. That night, as she sat by her fire, her knitting needles clicking in a steady rhythm, Miss Marple thought of the dinner to come she would attend. Of course she had her ways of securing an invitation, even if it meant a quiet word with Dolly Bantry. There, among the clink of crystal and the murmur of polite conversation, she would watch, she would listen, and, as always, she would see what others missed. For Miss Jane Marple knew that the smallest threadser-dropped handkerchief, a nervous glance, a whispered rumour could lead to the heart of even the most tangled mystery. And in St. Mary Mead, where secrets bloomed as quietly as the roses in Rose Cottage's garden, she was ready to pull those threads until the truth came undone. Chapter 2. Shadows at the feasted dining room at Willow Grange glowed with the warmth of candlelight. The long mahogany table, adorned with silver candelabras and a spread that would have made the most discerning London host proud, crystal glasses, caught the flicker of flames, casting prisms across the damask tablecloth, while the scent of roasted pheasant and herbed potatoes mingled with the faint tang of beeswax. Miss Jane Marple, seated near the foot of the table, adjusted her shawl, and let her sharp eyes roam over the assembled guests. Her knitting needles lay idle in her lap, a silent prop that allowed her to blend into the background, unnoticed yet all-seeing. Leonard Ashby, the enigmatic host, presided at the head of the table with a practiced smile that didn't quite reach. His eyes, his tailored suit and polished manners marked him as a man accustomed to wealth. But Miss Marple noted the slight tremor in his hand as he raised his wineglass for a toast. "To new friends and old secrets," he said, his voice smooth as velvet, though it carried an edge that made the room pause. The guests St. Mary Mead's elite, from the pompous Colonel Bantry to the twittering Mrs. Langley, clinked glasses, their laughter a touch too loud, as if to drown out the unease that hung in the air. Clara Wren, introduced as Ashby's secretary, moved about the room with a tray of wine, her movements precise but her face pale. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the young woman, whose auburn hair was pinned tightly, as if to restrain some inner turmoil. Clara's hands trembled as she poured for Mr. Roland Gibbs, a burly man with a ruddy complexion and a scowl that seemed permanent. Gibbs, a newcomer to the village, had arrived with a reputation as a retired financier, though his coarse manners suggested otherwise. Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly as she recalled the gossip at the tea shop. Gibbs had been seen arguing with Ashby at the Red Lion in something about a missing ledger. The dinner progressed with the clatter of cutlery and the hum of polite conversation. But Miss Marple's attention was drawn to the undercurrents. Mrs. Beatrice Langley, resplendent in a sapphire blue gown and a glittering brooch pinned to her bodice, was regaling the table with tales of her London season. Of course, the Duchess of Claremont insisted I wear her tiara at the ball, she said, her voice carrying a practised boast. Her husband, Mr. Langley, a quiet man with a penchant for botany, nodded absently, his eyes fixed on his plate. Across from them, Miss Violet Henshaw, the village librarian, fidgeted with her napkin, her sharp eyes darting toward Ashby whenever he spoke. Miss Marple's fingers brushed the wool in her lap, her mind cataloguing every glance, every pause. She had a way of seeing people, not as they presented themselves, but as they were stripped of pretense, their motives laid bare like the bones of a well-cooked fish. Ashby's charm was a mask, she decided, and Clara's fear was not that of a mere servant. There was a story here, one woven from whispers and shadows, and Miss Marple intended to unravel it. The first hint of discord came midway through the main course. Gibbs, his face flushed from wine, leaned toward Ashby and muttered something about the ledger again. His voice was low, but Miss Marple's keen ears caught the words. Ashby's smile faltered, and he replied sharply, "Not here, Roland. We'll discuss it later." Clara, standing nearby, nearly dropped the decanter, her eyes wide with alarm. Miss Marple noted the exchange, her mind turning over the possibilities. A ledger, she thought. Money, debts, or secrets always at the heart of trouble. The evening took a sharper turn when Mrs. Langley let out a gasp, her hand flying to her chest. "My brooch," she cried, her voice cutting through the chatter. "My sapphire brooch is gone." The table fell silent, all eyes on her as she stood, her chair scraping against the polished floor. The brooch, a family heirloom encrusted with gems, was nowhere to be seen. Colonel Bantry, ever the gallant, leaped to his feet, declaring, "We'll search at once." "No one leaves this room," the guests murmured, some indignant, others uneasy, as Ashby called for calm. "It's likely slipped off," he said, though his eyes darted toward Clara, who stood frozen by the sideboard. Miss Marple, however, remained seated, her gaze sweeping the room. A theft, she mused, was rarely what it seemed in a house like this. She recalled a similar incident in St. Mary Mead years ago, when a missing necklace had been employed to distract from a far graver crime. Her eyes narrowed as she watched Clara edge toward the door, only to be stopped by Ashby's sharp glance. The search began, with Colonel Bantry and Mr. Langley inspecting coats and bags, while Mrs. Langley wrung her hands, lamenting the loss. Miss Violet Henshaw, ever practical, suggested checking the floor, and soon the guests were on their hands and knees, peering under the table. Miss Marple, however, slipped quietly from her seat and moved toward Ashby's study, adjacent to the dining room. She had noticed a flicker of movement there earlier, when Clara had excused herself briefly during the soup course. The study was dimly lit, the heavy curtains drawn against the night. Miss Marple's eyes adjusted to the gloom, and she spotted a desk cluttered with papers. Among them was a torn scrap, no larger than a postage stamp, with a series of numbers scrawled in ink, 3712. She slipped it into her sleeve, her heart quickening. Numbers, she thought, could mean anything, bank accounts, dates, or codes. But in a house like Willow Grange, they were unlikely to be innocent. Returning to the dining room, she found the search in full swing. Clara, her face ashen, was being questioned by Colonel Bantry, who seemed convinced the brooch had been stolen by a servant. "It's always the staff," he muttered, ignoring Clara's trembling denial. Miss Marple, however, caught sight of a glint in the folds of Mr. Gibbs' overcoat, draped over a chair. She stepped forward, her voice gentle but firm. "Perhaps we might check the pockets one last time," she suggested. Gibbs bristled, but Ashby, eager to diffuse the tension, agreed. To everyone's surprise, the brooch tumbled out of Gibbs' coat, sparkling in the candlelight. A gasp went up, followed by accusations. "I didn't take it," Gibbs roared, his face purple. "Someone planted it there." Mrs. Langley, mollified, clutched her brooch and sank back into her chair, while the other guests exchanged uneasy glances. Miss Marple, however, was not convinced. The brooch's recovery was too neat, too convenient. She watched Ashby, who seemed relieved but not surprised, and Clara, whose hands still shook as she cleared the dessert plates. The scrap of paper in Miss Marple's sleeve felt heavy with promise. It was no ordinary theft, she decided. The brooch was a distraction, a way to shift attention from something else, perhaps that missing ledger. As the evening wound down, the guests departed, their chatter subdued. Miss Marple lingered, offering to help Clara tidy the dining room. The young woman's eyes were red-rimmed, and she flinched when Miss Marple touched her arm. "You seem troubled, my dear Miss Marple," said softly, her tone that of a kindly aunt. "A house like this can hold many secrets." Clara's lips parted, but she said nothing, only shook her head and hurried away. Miss Marple watched her go, her mind turning over the evening's events. The ledger, the numbers, the brooch, all pieces of a puzzle that pointed to Leonard. Ashby, she thought of her old friend Mrs. McGillicuddy, who had once been swindled by a charming man with a ledger full of lies. People, Miss Marple knew, were predictable in their greed and fear, and Ashby, with his polished smiles and shadowed eyes, was hiding something worth stealing, a brooch to conceal Dot as she stepped into the cool night air, the scrap of paper safe. In her sleeve, Miss Marple resolved to keep her eyes open. The dinner had been a stage, and the players had revealed more than they intended. Tomorrow she would visit the village post office, where gossip flowed as freely as tea. There she might find the next thread in this tangled web that, she suspected, led to a far darker secret than a missing jewel. Chapter 3. The Midnight Visitor. The night was unusually still in St. Mary Mead, the kind of quiet that seemed to hold its breath, waiting for something to stir. The moon hung low, a pale crescent casting long, skeletal shadows across the cobblestone lanes. Miss Jane Marple sat by her open window, her knitting needles paused mid-stitch, as the faint chime of the village clock struck midnight. She wasn't one for sleepless nights, but something about the evening's dinner at Willow Grange had left her mind restless. Turning over the puzzle of Mr. Leonard Ashby's guarded demeanour and Clara, Wren's trembling hands, the dinner had been a spectacle of polished silver and forced smiles, but Miss Marple's keen eyes had caught the undercurrents the way. Ashby's charm faltered when Mr. Roland Gibbs mentioned a missing ledger, the way Clara's fingers fumbled with the wine decanter, and then there was the scrap of paper she'd found in Ashby's study, tucked beneath a book on estate management, its cryptic numbers hinting at a financial secret. Miss Marple didn't believe in coincidences. That scrap was no accident. It was a thread, and she intended to pull it, as she sat, her gaze drifting over the darkened village. A faint sound broke the silence, a soft crunch of gravel, not from the main road but closer, near the hedgerows lining Willow Grange's grounds. Miss Marple leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. A figure, slight and cloaked in shadow, slipped through the gate of the estate, moving with the cautious grace of someone who didn't want to be seen. The moonlight caught a glint of pale hair Clara Wren. Miss Marple set her knitting aside, her curiosity piqued. Clara, the nervous young woman who'd dropped that monogrammed handkerchief marked L.A. at the tea shop, was not the sort to wander at midnight without reason. Miss Marple's instincts, honed by years of observing the quiet dramas of village life, told her this was no ordinary errand. She reached for her shawl, her movements brisk despite the late hour. If Clara was sneaking about, there was something to be learnt. Slipping on her sturdy shoes and wrapping the shawl tightly around her shoulders, Miss Marple stepped into the cool night air. The village was asleep, its cottages dark save for the occasional flicker of a candle. She moved quietly, keeping to the shadows, her steps light but purposeful. The path to Willow Grange was familiar, winding past the vicarage and the old mill. As she approached the estate's iron gates, she saw Clara's figure dart toward the overgrown garden at the property's edge, where an ancient stone well stood, half hidden by ivy. Miss Marple paused behind a gnarled oak, her breath steady, despite the thrill of pursuit. Clara knelt by the well, her hands fumbling with something small, a package, perhaps wrapped in dark cloth. She glanced around, her movements jerky, before tucking the bundle beneath a loose stone at the well's base. Then, as quickly as she'd come, Clara hurried back toward the house, her footsteps fading into the night. Miss Marple waited, counting to 10 to ensure Clara was gone. The air was sharp with the scent of damp earth and late-blooming roses. She approached the well, her fingers brushing the rough stone as she crouched to retrieve the package. It was heavier than she'd expected, a tightly bound bundle of letters tied with twine. In the faint moonlight, she could make out the initials, Lars, scrawled on the topmost envelope. Her heart quickened. Leonard Ashby's initials, no doubt, but why was Clara hiding them? She tucked the bundle into her shawl, her mind already racing. Clara's fear at the dinner, her trembling hands, her startled reaction when Miss Marple had returned the handkerchief, these were not the actions of a guilty woman, but of one protecting something or someone. Miss Marple's secret weapon, her profound understanding of human nature, told her Clara was acting out of loyalty or fear, perhaps both. The letters were a clue, but to what? As she turned to leave, a rustling in the bushes made her freeze. Her eyes scanned the darkness, catching the faint outline of a mantle. Broad-shouldered, his face obscured by a low-brimmed hat, he stood at the edge of the garden, motionless, as if watching the well. Miss Marple held her breath, her small frame blending into the shadow of the well. The stranger lingered for a moment, then turned and vanished into the night, his footsteps heavy on the gravel path. Miss Marple's pulse steadied, but her mind was alight with questions. Who was this midnight visitor? A guest from the dinner, perhaps, or someone else drawn to Willow Grange's secrets? She made her way back to her cottage, the bundle of letters secure beneath her shawl. The village was silent again, but the air felt charged, as if the night itself knew a mystery was unfolding. The next morning, St. Mary Mead buzzed with the kind of gossip that thrived on small details. At the post office, Mrs. Weatherby, the postmistress, was in full flow, her voice carrying over the clink of coins and the rustle of envelopes. A stranger, I tell you, skulking by the old well at Willow Grange. Young Tommy saw him last night, bold as brass, wearing a hat like some city gent. What's Mr. Ashby got going on up there? That's what I'd like to know." Miss Marple, collecting her Morning Post, listened with her usual air of mild interest. Her eyes on her letters, but her ears attuned to every word. Tommy, the baker's boy, was prone to exaggeration, but the mention of a stranger by the well confirmed her own sighting. She thanked Mrs. Weatherby and stepped outside, her mind turning to the bundle hidden in her knitting basket. Back at her cottage, she settled, by the fire with a cup of tea and the letters. There were 5 in total, each addressed to L.A., in a precise, slanting hand. The paper was expensive, the kind used by city bankers or solicitors, and the postmarks were from London, dated over the past year. Miss Marple opened the first letter, her fingers careful not to tear the fragile paper. The contents were brief but cryptic. "The Meridian deal is set for the 15th. Ensure the funds are ready. Trust is paramount." The other letters followed a similar pattern, mentioning dates, sums, and the Meridian deal with no names or specifics. One, however, stood out a single line in a hurried scrawl. "They suspect the ledgers are falsified. Burn this, Miss." Marple's lips pursed. Forgery, financial schemes, a mysterious deal, these were not the petty intrigues of village life. Leonard Ashby, it seemed, was tangled in something far larger than St. Mary Mead. As she folded the letters, a knock at the door startled her. She slipped the bundle into her basket and opened the door to find Inspector Harrow, his face as stern as ever beneath his neatly trimmed moustache. "Good morning, Miss Marple," he said, tipping his hat. "I hope I'm not disturbing you. I'm making inquiries about some trouble at Willow Grange." Miss Marple invited him in, her expression one of polite concern. "Trouble, Inspector? I do hope it's nothing serious." Harrow settled into her armchair, his notebook open. "Serious enough, I'm afraid. We've had reports from London about forged checks linked to Mr. Ashby's name. Nothing proven yet, but there's talk of a scheme called the Meridian Trust. Ever hear of it?" Miss Marple's eyes widened slightly, just enough to seem surprised. "The Meridian Trust? My goodness, no. It sounds terribly complicated. But Mr. Ashby seems such a charming man, doesn't he? Though, of course, one never knows." Harrow nodded, jotting something down. "Charming or not, there's something off about him. And that secretary of his, Miss Wrenchy's nervous as a cat. You were at the dinner last night, weren't you? Notice anything unusual?" Miss Marple tilted her head, as if considering. "Well, I did notice Miss Wren seemed a bit out of sorts. And there was that business with Mrs. Langley's brooch, though it was found, wasn't it? People do get so careless at these gatherings." Harrow grunted, clearly frustrated by the lack of solid leads. "The brooch was a distraction, if you ask me. Someone's covering something up. If you hear anything, Miss Marple, you'll let me know." "Of course, Inspector," she said, her smile serene. "I'm only a village spinster, but I do keep my eyes open." As Harrow left, Miss Marple returned to her tea, her mind racing. The inspector's mention of forged checks and the Meridian Trust confirmed her suspicions about the letters. But Clara's role puzzled her. Why hide the letters? Was she shielding Ashby or someone else? Miss Marple's understanding of fear-driven actions told her Clara was no mastermind, she was a pawn, caught in a game she didn't fully understand. That afternoon, Miss Marple took her usual walk through the village, her basket swinging lightly on her arm. She stopped at the tea shop, where Clara was buying a loaf of bread, her face pale and her eyes darting. Miss Marple approached, her voice gentle. "Miss Wren, might I have a word?" Clara flinched, nearly dropping her parcel. "Oh, Miss Marple, I'm in a bit of a hurry." "It won't take a moment," Miss Marple said, her tone soothing but firm. She led Clara to a quiet bench by the churchyard, where the scent of blooming lavender hung in the air. "I found something last night, near the well at Willow Grange." A bundle of letters, addressed to Ella. Clara's eyes widened, her hands twisting in her lap. You found them? Oh, please, Miss Marple, you mustn't tell anyone." "I shan't, my dear," Miss Marple said, patting her hand. "But I need to know why you hid them. Are they Mr. Ashby's?" Clara hesitated, her lips trembling. They are. But it's not what you think. He's not a bad man, not really. He's just in trouble. Those letters, they could ruin him. Ruin him how?" Miss Marple asked, her voice soft but probing. Clara shook her head, tears welling. "I can't say. I promised I wouldn't. But they're not safe, those letters. Someone's looking for them, someone dangerous." Miss Marple nodded, her mind fitting the pieces together. Clara's fear, the stranger by the well, the coded letters, it all pointed to a secret Ashby was desperate to keep. "Thank you, Clara," she said. "I'll keep your confidence. But be careful, my dear. Secrets have a way of coming out." As Clara hurried away, Miss Marple sat for a moment, the letters heavy in her basket. The stranger by the well, the forged checks, the Meridian Trust, it was a tangle, but one she was determined to unravel. Her next step was clear: decode the letters and find out who Allah was protecting, and why. The afternoon sun dipped low, casting long shadows across St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple rose, her eyes bright with purpose. The midnight visitor had left a trail, and she intended to follow it. Chapter 4. The code in the letters. The sun hung low over St. Mary Mead, casting a golden haze across the village green, where preparations for the annual fete were in full swing. Bunting fluttered between lampposts, children darted through the crowd with sticky toffee apples, and the air thrummed with the cheerful chaos of a community determined to outdo last year's revelry. Miss Jane Marple, seated on a wrought iron bench near the vicarage, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically, observed the scene with her usual quiet intensity. Her eyes, sharp as ever behind her spectacles, missed nothing, not the hurried whispers between stallholders, nor the fleeting shadow of unease on Clara Wren's face as she passed by with a basket of raffle tickets. Miss Marple's mind, however, was not on the fate's jumble of jam jars and homemade scones. It was fixed on the bundle of letters she had retrieved from the old well near Willow Grange, each one addressed to Ella, and laced with cryptic references to financial dealings. The letters, now tucked safely in her handbag, were a puzzle she intended to unravel. Their contents hinted at a shadowy scheme called the Meridian Trust, and a name, Eleanor Price, had emerged like a ghost from the pages. Tugging at her curiosity, she had enlisted Dr. Haydock's help that morning, meeting him in the quiet of his study, where the scent of old books and antiseptic mingled oddly. The doctor, a practical man with a penchant for puzzles, had spread the letters across his desk, his brow furrowed as he scanned the spidery handwriting. "These numbers," he'd said, pointing to a string of digits scrawled in the margins. "Of one letter, they're not random. Looks like a code, perhaps, a reference to accounts or transactions." Miss Marple had nodded, her mind already racing. A financial code, perhaps, but not the sort you'd find in a ledger. Too personal, too guarded. Whoever wrote these was hiding something, and I suspect Mr. Ashby is at the heart of it. Now, as the fate's laughter swirled around her, Miss Marple's thoughts returned to the letters. She had noticed something else, a faint watermark on the stationery, a crest resembling a crescent moon entwined with ivy. It was unusual, distinctive, and likely tied to the sender's identity. She made a mental note to inquire about it at the post office, where gossip flowed as freely as tea. The fate was a kaleidoscope of activity. A brass band played a jaunty tune near the cake stall, where Mrs. Beatrice Langley, still smarting from the brooch incident at Willow Grange, presided over a towering Victoria sponge. Miss Marple's gaze drifted to Mr. Roland Gibbs, the brusque guest from Ashby's dinner, who was arguing heatedly with Mr. Pye, the local shopkeeper near the second-hand bookstall. Gibbs's voice carried, sharp and indignant. "I paid that invoice weeks ago, Pye. Don't you dare imply otherwise." Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. Gibbs's temper was no surprise, but his mention of unpaid debts intrigued her. If Ashby was entangled in financial troubles, as the letters suggested, Gibbs might be more than a disgruntled guest. She filed the observation away, her needles never faltering. A sudden commotion at the charity box caught her attention. Mrs. Dolly Bantry, ever the enthusiastic organizer, was holding up a delicate silver locket, its surface engraved with the initials EP. The crowd murmured, speculating about its origins. "Found it in the donation box," Mrs. Bantry announced, her voice bright but puzzled. "No one's claimed it, but it's far too fine to be given away by mistake." Miss Marple's heart quickened. E. Pellinore Price. The coincidence was too stark to ignore. She rose, tucking her knitting into her bag, and approached the stall with her usual unassuming air. "What a lovely piece," she said, peering at the locket. "Might I see it, Dolly?" Mrs. Bantry handed it over, her eyes sparkling with curiosity. "Odd, isn't it? Someone must have slipped it in by accident. It's solid silver, and that engraving looks personal." Miss Marple turned the locket over in her hands, noting its weight and the faint scratches around the clasp, as if it had been opened and closed countless times. "Indeed," she murmured, "I wonder if the fate organizer might hold on to it until the owner comes forward. It would be a shame to lose something so cherished." Mrs. Bantry agreed, and Miss Marple watched as the locket was placed in a small envelope and tucked into the organizer's cash box. She had no intention of letting it vanish into the villagers' gossip mill. The locket, she suspected, was meant to be hidden, not donate a clue dropped by someone careless or desperate. She resolved to return it to the fate organizer later, claiming it was a mistake, but first she needed to confirm its connection to Eleanor Price. As the afternoon wore on, Miss Marple drifted through the fate, her presence as unremarkable as a shadow. She paused at the flower stall, where Clara Wren was arranging dahlias with a distracted air. The young woman's hands trembled slightly, and her eyes darted toward the charity box, as if expecting it to reveal a secret. Miss Marple approached, her voice gentle. "Miss Wren, you seem troubled. Is something amiss?" Clara started, nearly dropping a bouquet. "Oh, Miss Marple, no, I'm just tired. The fate's been so busy." "Quite," Miss Marple said, her tone soothing, but her eyes keen. "I couldn't help noticing the locket in the charity box. Such a curious item to be donated, don't you think?" Clara's face paled, and she busied herself with the flowers. I wouldn't know anything about that." Miss Marple smiled. "Undeterred, of course, dear. But if you happen to hear anything about its owner, do let Mrs. Bantry know. It's the sort of thing someone might miss dearly." Clara nodded, her expression guarded. and Miss Marple moved on, her mind buzzing. Clara's reaction confirmed her suspicions. The locket was no accident. It was linked to the letters, to Ashby, and perhaps to the mysterious Eleanor Price. But who had donated it, and why? The fate's noise faded as Miss Marple slipped away to the vicarage garden, where she could think undisturbed. She settled on a bench beneath a gnarled apple tree, pulling the letters from her handbag. The coded numbers stared back at her, stubborn and enigmatic. Dr. Haydock had suggested they might reference bank accounts or transactions, but Miss Marple suspected something more personal, a private code between Ashby and someone close to him. The watermark, that crescent moon and ivy, nagged at her. She had seen something like it before, perhaps in an old book or letterhead, but the memory eluded her. Her thoughts were interrupted by the crunch of gravel. Inspector Harrow, his face as stern as ever, approached with a purposeful stride. "Miss Marple," he said, tipping his hat. "I heard you were at the fete. Mind if I join you?" "Not at all, Inspector," she replied, gesturing to the bench. "I take it you're not here for the scones." Harrow chuckled, but his eyes were serious. "No, ma'am. I've had word from London about Ashby. Seems he was involved with a scheme called the Meridian Trust a few years back. Went bust, left a lot of investors in the lurch. There's talk of forged checks tied to his name, but nothing solid yet." Miss Marple's needles paused, though her expression remained serene. "The Meridian Trust, you say? How curious. I've heard that name recently." Harrow raised an eyebrow. "Have you now? Care to share?" "Oh, just village gossip," she said airily, though her mind was racing. "People do talk, especially at a fete. Have you spoken to Mr. Gibbs? He seems unsettled." Harrow's jaw tightened. "Gibbs is a piece of work. Claims Ashby owes him money, but he's cagey about the details. I'm keeping an eye on him." "As you should," Miss Marple said, her tone mild, but her mind cataloguing every word. Gibbs, Clara, the locket, the letters, all pieces of a puzzle that was beginning to take shape. She needed to know more about Eleanor Price, and she suspected the post office might hold the key the next morning. Miss Marple visited the post office, a cramped room filled with the scent of ink and paper. Miss Hartnell, the postmistress, was sorting letters with her usual efficiency, her sharp eyes missing nothing. "Good morning, Miss Marple," she said. "Come for the fate's mail. We've had quite a pile." "Actually," Miss Marple said, leaning conspiratorially over the counter, "I was wondering about some stationery I saw recently. A crest with a crescent moon and ivy, quite distinctive. Have you seen anything like it?" Miss Hart's eyes lit up with the thrill of gossip. "Oh, that sounds like the Ashby family crest. Old Leonard Ashby's father used it on his letterheads, back when he owned half the mills in Devon. I've seen it on some of Mr. Ashby's letters, though. He doesn't send many. Keeps to himself, that one." Miss Marple nodded, her suspicions confirmed. The letters were Ashby's, but why were they hidden? And why addressed to Lara? She thanked Miss Hartnell and left, her mind turning to the locket. It was time to return it to the fate organizer and gauge the reaction. At the vicarage, Mrs. Bantry was delighted to see her. "Miss Marple, you're a saint for keeping an eye on that locket. I was about to send it to the church safe, but if you think it's a mistake—" "I do," Miss Marple said, handing over the envelope. "Perhaps someone will claim it soon." As Mrs. Bantry tucked the locket away, Miss Marple caught a glimpse of Clara Wren passing by the window, her face pale and her steps hurried. The girl was a bundle of nerves, and Miss Marple's heart softened. Clara was protecting someone, perhaps Ashby, perhaps Eleanor Price. Her secret weapon, her understanding of human nature, told her Clara's fear stemmed from loyalty, not guilt. That evening, Miss Marple sat by her fire, the letters spread before her. The coded numbers seemed to dance in the firelight, teasing her with their secrets. She traced the watermark with her finger, the crescent moon and ivy stalk against the paper. Eleanor Price, the Meridian Trust, the locket, Clara's ferret, all pointed to a scandal buried in Ashby's past. One he was desperate to keep hidden. A knock at the door startled her. It was Clara, her face pale and her eyes wide. "Mr. Marple," she whispered, "I need to talk to you. It's about the locket." Miss Marple ushered her inside, her heart racing. "Of course, dear. Sit down and tell me everything." Clara hesitated, then spoke in a rush. "The locket. It was Eleanor's. I didn't mean for it to end up at the fete. I was supposed to hide it, but I panicked. Mr. Ashby doesn't know I took it." Miss Marple's eyes softened, but her mind was razor sharp. "And the letters, are they his too?" Clara nodded, tears brimming. "They're from years ago, when he was involved with the Meridian Trust. I found them in his study. He's afraid they'll ruin him if they get out." Miss Marple patted her hand. "You've done the right thing, Clara. Now, let's see what we can do about those letters." As Clara left, Miss Marple's mind whirred. The locket's return would quiet the village gossip, but the letters and Eleanor Price's name opened a new door. She would need to tread carefully, but the threads of the mystery were coming together, and Miss Marple was determined to follow them to the end. Chapter 5. The Ghost of Eleanor Price. The late summer sun hung low over St. Mary Mead, casting golden streaks across the cobblestones and painting the village in a warm, deceptive glow. Miss Jane Marple sat in her garden, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically, though her mind was far from the soft wool in her hands. The air carried the faint scent of roses and the distant hum of the village fate's clean-up. But her thoughts were tethered to the singed envelope she'd retrieved from the post office floor, its cryptic mention of proof of fraud burning brighter in her memory than the evening light. Mrs. Dolly Bantry's revelation about Eleanor Price had stirred something in Miss Marple, a flicker of recognition, not of a face, but of a pattern. Eleanor, a London heiress, had vanished after pouring her fortune into the Meridian Trust, a venture whispered to be Leonard Ashby's doing. The singed envelope, dropped by Clara Wren in her moment of panic, was no coincidence, nor was the sudden arrival of Miss Lydia Price, claiming to be Eleanor's cousin, who had appeared in St. Mary Mead with questions sharper than her tailored coat. Miss Marple's secret weapon, her unerring sense of human loyalty and fear, told her Clara was shielding someone, and Lydia's arrival was no mere family errand. The threads of the mystery were knitting together, but the pattern was still incomplete. The post office, a quaint hub of gossip and parcels, had been unusually quiet that morning when Miss Marple witnessed Clara's encounter with Lydia. Clara, pale and jittery, had been sorting letters behind the counter when Lydia strode in, her dark eyes scanning the room like a hawk. Their exchange was brief, but charged. Clara's hands fumbled, and the envelope fell, its edge charred as if kissed by a flame. Miss Marple, pretending to examine a rack of postcards, had swooped in with her usual unobtrusive grace, retrieving the scrap before Clara could notice. The words "proof of fraud" were scrawled in a hasty hand, and Miss Marple's mind had already begun weaving connections to the Meridian Trust and Eleanor Price. Now, As the evening settled, Miss Marple tucked her knitting into its basket and rose, smoothing her skirt. Lydia had agreed to meet her at the vicarage, a neutral ground where prying ears were fewer. The vicarage, with its ivy-clad walls and air of quiet sanctity, was the perfect place for secrets to be shared or guarded. Miss Marple adjusted her hat, picked up her worn leather handbag, and set off down the lane, her steps light but purposeful. The vicarage parlour was cosy, with a fire crackling in the hearth despite the mild weather. Vicar Clement, ever obliging, had left them alone, muttering about sermon notes. Lydia Price sat stiffly on a chintz-covered chair, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She was younger than Miss Marple had expected, perhaps 30, with sharp cheekbones and hair pinned tightly under a cloached hat. Her grey dress was elegant but severe, as if she wore her resolve like armour. "Thank you for meeting me, Miss Marple," Lydia said, her voice low but steady. "I wasn't sure who to trust in this village, but Mrs. Bantry spoke highly of you." Miss Marple smiled, her eyes crinkling with warmth that belied their sharpness. "Mrs. Bantry is too kind. I'm merely an old woman who listens. You're here about your cousin, Eleanor, I presume?" Lydia's lips tightened, and she nodded. Eleanor disappeared 3 years ago, after the Meridian Trust collapsed. She'd invested everything, her inheritance, her future. She was convinced Leonard Ashby was behind it, that he'd swindled her and others. She wrote to me, saying she had proof, but then her voice faltered. She was gone. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her hands folded in her lap. "And you believe this proof is here, in St. Mary Mead?" Lydia hesitated, glancing at the fire as if it might reveal something. "I received a letter 2 weeks ago, unsigned, postmarked from this village. It said Eleanor's evidence was hidden here and that Ashby was back to cover his tracks. I came as soon as I could." Miss Marple's mind flicked to the singed envelope, now tucked safely in her handbag. Did Eleanor ever mention a Clara Wren, or perhaps a financial ledger? Lydia's eyes widened just for a moment before she masked her surprise. "Clara, no, but I saw her at the post office today. She looked terrified when I mentioned Eleanor's name. Do you think she knows something?" "I think," Miss Marple said carefully, "that Clara is protecting someone, perhaps out of loyalty or fear. People often hide what they cherish most, don't they? Like a locket or a bundle of letters." Lydia's hand twitched, as if reaching for something unseen. "You know about the locket?" Miss Marple's smile was gentle but unyielding. "Only that it appeared in the Fates charity box. Engraved with EP, a curious mistake, don't you think, for something so personal to be donated?" Lydia exhaled, her shoulders sagging. "It was mine. I dropped it at the Fate, and someone must have thought it was for charity. It was Eleanor's before she gave it to me a keepsake. I didn't mean for it to cause a stir." Miss Marple nodded, her mind racing. The locket, like the singed envelope, was a thread in the tapestry, but the pattern was still elusive, and the proof Eleanor claimed to have. "Do you know what it was?" Lydia leaned closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. She said it was documents, bank records, signatures, proof that Ashby falsified the Meridian Trust's accounts. She hid them before she vanished, but she never told me where. I think Clara knows. That's why I came to St. Mary Mead." The fire crackled, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed in the light, her thoughts weaving through the village's quiet lanes to Willow Grange, where Ashby's charm masked something darker. Clara's fear, the singed envelope, Lydia's locket, all were pieces of a puzzle, and Miss Marple's gift was seeing how they fit. "Miss Price," she said softly, "would you trust me to help you find this proof? I believe Clara may be the key, but we must tread carefully. Fear makes people unpredictable." Lydia studied her, then nodded. "I trust you, but Ashby's dangerous. If he knows I'm here, then we shall be discreet," Miss Marple said, rising. "Come to my cottage tomorrow afternoon. We'll have tea, and perhaps Clara will join us. People often speak more freely over a cup of Earl Grey." As Lydia left, her footsteps echoing on the vicarage path, Miss Marple sat back, her mind alight with possibilities. The singed envelope lay heavy in her handbag, and she resolved to examine it further. The night was still young, and St. Mary Mead held secrets yet to be unravelled. The next morning, the village buzzed with the aftermath of the fate. Stalls were being dismantled, and children darted through the square, chasing stray balloons. Miss Marple, however, was at her cottage, her table covered with the letters from Clara's package and the singed envelope. The letters, addressed to LA, were a mix of financial notes and cryptic warnings, but the singed envelope was different. Its paper was thicker, the ink smudged but legible. Proof of fraud, Meridian, Trustee P. to LA. The handwriting matched the letters, suggesting Eleanor had written it herself. Miss Marple's fingers traced the charred edge. Why burn? It had Clara tried to destroy it, only to falter. Or had someone else, Ashby, perhaps interrupted her? The thought sent a shiver through her, not of fear, but of anticipation. She knew the village's rhythm, how secrets pulsed beneath its surface like a heartbeat. Clara's fear, Lydia's resolve, Ashby's charm, they were all part of the same melody. At noon, Clara appeared at the cottage, her face pale and her eyes darting. Miss Marple greeted her with a warm smile, ushering her to a chair by the window. "My dear, you look as if you've seen a ghost." "Tea?" Clara nodded, clutching her shawl. I didn't expect you to ask me here, Miss Marple, after yesterday." "The post office was rather eventful," Miss Marple said, pouring tea. With a steady hand, "I couldn't help but notice your distress when Miss Price arrived. She's searching for her cousin, you know." Clara's cup rattled against its saucer. "Eleanor Price." I never met her. I only know what Mr. Ashby told me." "And what did he tell you?" Miss Marple's tone was gentle, but her eyes missed nothing. Clara hesitated, then spoke in a rush. "He said Eleanor was a business partner who betrayed him, spread lies about the Meridian Trust. He said she disappeared with money that wasn't hers. But I found letters in his study letters she wrote to him, warning him to confess. I hid them because I was afraid of Mr. Ashby." Miss Marple asked, her voice soft as a whisper. Clara's eyes filled with tears. "Not just him. Someone's been watching Willow Grange. I saw a man in the woods last night, near the old well. I think he's looking for the same thing Miss Price wants." Miss Marple's heart quickened. The stranger near the well, the singed envelope, the letters, it was all converging. "Clara, my dear, did you try to burn something yesterday? A letter, perhaps?" Clara froze, then nodded. "I thought it was safer to destroy it, but I couldn't. It felt wrong." Miss Marple reached into her handbag and produced the singed envelope. "Is this what you meant?" Clara gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "Where did you?" "It fell at the post office," Miss Marple said calmly. "I kept it safe. Now, Clara, tell me everything. For Eleanor's sake, and for Lydia's." Clara's story tumbled out like a dam breaking. She'd been Ashby's secretary for a year, hired after arriving in St. Mary Mead with little money and fewer prospects. Ashby was kind at first, but his late-night meetings and cryptic phone calls grew suspicious. She found the letters in his desk, hidden in a false bottom, and realized they were Eleanor's pleas for him to admit his fraud. The singed envelope contained a ledger page torn from a larger book, detailing transactions that matched the Meridian Trust's collapse. Clara had hidden the letters by the well, hoping to protect Eleanor's memory. But fear kept her silent. "I didn't know what to do," Clara whispered. "Mr. Ashby said if I spoke, I'd lose everything. But I couldn't let him destroy." Her name, Miss Marple patted her hand. "You've done the right thing, my dear. Now, we must be careful. If someone else is searching for these letters, we need to act quickly." That afternoon, Lydia arrived, her face taut with determination. Miss Marple had laid out a simple teascone's jam and a pot of Earl Grey butt. The air was thick with tension. Clara sat across from Lydia, her hands twisting in her lap, while Miss Marple presided like a quiet conductor of truths. "Miss Price," Miss Marple began, "Clara has something to tell you about Eleanor." Clara took a shaky breath, recounting the letters and the ledger page. Lydia listened, her eyes glistening but her jaw set. "Eleanor was trying to expose him," she said when Clara finished. "She knew he'd ruin others, just like he ruined her. That ledger pagits the proof we need." Miss Marple nodded, producing the singed envelope. "This mentions proof of fraud. I believe it's part of a larger document, hidden somewhere Ashby can't find." "Clara, you said you saw a stranger near the well. Could it be Mr. Gibbs?" Clara frowned. "I don't think so. Gibbs is loud, brash. This man was quiet, like a shadow." Lydia's hand tightened around her teacup. "Ashby's not working alone. Eleanor hinted at a partner in her letters, someone higher up. If they know we're close, then we must move quickly," Miss Marple said. "Tonight we'll retrieve the letters from the well. But we must be cautious. Ashby's dinner is tomorrow, and I suspect he's planning something to cover his tracks." That night, under a moonless sky, Miss Marple, Lydia, and Clara crept toward Willow Grange's old well. The air was heavy with the scent of damp earth and pine. Miss Marple carried a small torch, its beam cutting through the darkness. Clara led them to a loose stone by the well, where she'd hidden the bundle of letters. As Lydia reached for them, a twig snapped nearby. Miss Marple's hand shot up, silencing them. A figure emerged from the shadows, not Gibbs, but a lean man with a scar across his cheek. His eyes glinted with menace, and in his hand was a small, glinting knife. "Hand over the letters," he growled, his voice low and unfamiliar. Miss Marple stepped forward, her voice calm but firm. "Young man, I don't know who you are, but I suggest you put that away. This is St. Mary Mead, not some London alley." The man hesitated, startled by her composure. Lydia seized the moment, grabbing the bundle and bolting toward the village. Clara screamed, and the man lunged, but Miss Marple swung her torch, catching him off guard. He stumbled, cursing, and vanished into the woods. Breathless, they returned to Miss Marple's cottage, the bundle safe. The letters confirmed accusations. Ashby had falsified the Meridian Trust's accounts, siphoning funds with a partner named V. The ledger page listed transactions that could ruin him if they reached Inspector Harrow. The next morning, Miss Marple sat with Inspector Harrow at the police station, the letters and ledger page spread before him. Lydia and Clara stood nearby, their faces a mix of relief and resolve. Harrow, a gruff but fair man, studied the documents, his brow furrowing. "This is enough to bring Ashby in," he said. "But this we need to find him. Any ideas, Miss Marple?" She smiled faintly. "I have a suspicion. Mr. Gibbs has been too quick to argue with Ashby, too eager to deflect blame. Watch him at the dinner tonight, Inspector. People reveal themselves when they're cornered." As Harrow nodded, Miss Marple glanced at Lydia and Clara. The mystery of Eleanor Price was unraveling, but the ghost of her betrayal lingered. The dinner at Willow Grange would be the final act, and Miss Marple's sharp eyes would miss nothing. The chapter closed with Lydia squeezing Clara's hand, a silent pact forged in the face of truth. Miss Marple returned to her knitting, the click of her needles a quiet promise that justice, like her stitches, would hold fast. Chapter 6. The hidden room. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the cobbled path leading to Willow Grange, its golden rays filtering through the ancient yews that guarded the manor's entrance. Miss Jane Marple, her straw hat tilted, just so, walked with a purposeful yet unhurried gait, a worn copy of Pride and Prejudice tucked under her arm. To any observer in St. Mary Mead, she was merely an elderly spinster borrowing a book from a neighbour, her visit as innocuous as a summer breeze. But beneath her placid exterior, Miss Marple's mind was a whirl of connections, suspicions, and carefully catalogued observations. The excuse for her visit was simple. Mrs. Langley, a notorious gossip and Willow Grange's occasional guest, had mentioned a rare volume of Austen's letters in the manor's library. Miss Marple, ever the opportunist, had seized upon the chance to gain entry to the Ashby household, where whispers of financial misdeeds and a missing woman named Eleanor Price had begun to ripple through the village. The fate, with its missing locket and cryptic ledger entries, had only deepened her curiosity. Willow Grange, she suspected, held secrets as tightly as its ivy-clad walls. The heavy oak door creaked open, revealing Gibbs, the manor's groundskeeper and general factotum. His broad shoulders filled the doorway, and his weathered face, usually impassive, betrayed a flicker of unease as he recognized his visitor. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice gruff but polite. "Didn't expect you today." "Oh, Gibbs, I do hope I'm not intruding," Miss Marple replied, her tone light and disarming. "Mrs. Langley mentioned a collection of Austen's letters in the library. I thought I might borrow one, if Mr. Ashby doesn't mind." Gibbs hesitated, his thick fingers twitching at his side. "Mr. Ashby's out, ma'am, but I suppose the library's open. Follow me." As they crossed the grand hall, Miss Marple's sharp eyes darted about, noting the polished mahogany banisters, the faded tapestries, and the faint smell of wax and old secrets. The library, when they reached it, was a cavernous room lined with towering bookshelves, their dark wood gleaming under the soft glow of brass lamps. A portrait of a stern-faced man, presumably an Ashby ancestor, hung above the fireplace, his eyes seeming to follow her every step. "Here we are," Gibbs said, gesturing vaguely toward the shelves. "Books are, well, everywhere. Help yourself." "Thank you, Gibbs," Miss Marple said, her smile as warm as ever. "I shan't be long." As Gibbs retreated to the doorway, lingering just a bit too long, Miss Marple began her charade. She ran her fingers along the spines of leather-bound volumes, murmuring titles under her breath as if searching for something specific, but her attention was elsewhere on the room itself. She had overheard Florence, her maid, recounting a curious tale from the village baker, A delivery boy had once seen a panel in the library shift, revealing a glimpse of something beyond. A hidden room, perhaps, in a manor as old as Willow Grange. Such architectural quirks were not uncommon. But Miss Marple suspected this one held more than cobwebs. Her fingers brushed against a loose panel near the fireplace, its edge slightly misaligned with the rest of the bookcase. She pressed gently, and with a soft click, the panel gave way, revealing a narrow seam in the wood. Her heart quickened, though her expression remained serene. Glancing over her shoulder, Gibbs was nowhere in sight. She pushed harder, and a section of the bookcase swung inward, revealing a dark, narrow chamber beyond. The air inside was cool and musty, carrying the faint scent of old paper and metal. Miss Marple stepped cautiously into the hidden room, her eyes adjusting to the dim light filtering through a high, narrow window. The space was small, barely larger than a closet, with a single wooden table at its center. On the table sat a locked iron box, its surface etched with faint scratches, as if someone had tried and failed to pry it open. Beside it lay a stack of ledgers, their covers marked with the words Meridian Trust in faded ink. Miss Marple's lips pursed. Meridian Trust, a name that had surfaced in village gossip, tied to rumors of financial ruin and missing funds. She reached for one of the ledgers, her gloved fingers tracing the embossed letters. As she opened it, rows of numbers and names greeted her, meticulously recorded but cryptic in their purpose. One entry caught her eye. E. Price, £500, transferred, 1923. Eleanor Price, the missing woman whose name had haunted St. Mary Mead's whispers before she could read further. A sharp creak echoed from the library. Miss Marple froze, slipping the ledger back into place. Footsteps approached, heavy, deliberate. Gibbs appeared in the doorway of the hidden room, a hammer in one hand and a rag in the other, his face pale despite his attempt at nonchalance. "Miss Marple," he exclaimed, his voice a touch too loud. "Didn't know you'd found this. Just a storage nook. I'm fixing some shelves." Miss Marple turned, her expression one of mild surprise, as if she'd merely stumbled upon an interesting trinket. "Oh, Gibbs, how fascinating. A hidden room. I suppose old houses like this are full of surprises. But you look a bit flustered, dear. Is everything all right?" Gibbs's eyes darted to the iron box, then back to her. "Fine, ma'am. Just didn't expect anyone to find this place. It's not used much." "Not used," Miss Marple said, her tone gently probing. "And yet it's so tidy. Someone must come here often." Gibbs shifted his weight, the hammer dangling awkwardly at his side. "Just me, ma'am. Checking for damp, that sort of thing." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes twinkling with that quiet, knowing gleam that had unnerved many a guilty soul. She had seen this before. Men like Gibbs, loyal to a fault, guarding secrets they didn't fully understand. In her village, she'd known a gardener who'd hidden stolen silver for his employer, his nervous tics betraying him long before the truth emerged. Gibbs's unease was a mirror of that man's, and Miss Marple filed it away for later. "Well, I shan't keep you, Gibbs," she said, stepping back into the library. "I didn't find the Austen letters, but perhaps another time. Do give Mr. Ashby my regards." Gibbs muttered something incoherent, his relief palpable as the bookcase clicked shut behind her. Miss Marple left the library with her usual unhurried grace, but her mind was racing. The ledgers, the box, Gibbs's agitation, each was a thread in a tapestry she was only beginning to unravel. and Eleanor Price's name, tied to Meridian Trust, was a knot she couldn't ignore. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and Willow Grange's windows glowed with lamplight, Miss Marple sat in her cottage, knitting a pale blue shawl. Florence, her young maid, bustled about, setting out a modest supper of tea and scones. The air was warm, scented with lavender from the garden, but a sudden, piercing scream shattered the tranquillity. It came from the direction of Willow Grange, sharp and fleeting, like a bird startled from its perch. Florence gasped, nearly dropping the teapot. "Good heavens, Miss Marple, what was that?" Miss Marple's needles paused, her eyes narrowing. "A scream, Florence. From the manor, I'd wager. Fetch my shawl, dear. I think we'd best see what's happened." By the time they reached Willow Grange, the manor was ablaze with activity. Servants whispered in corners, and Mr. Ashby stood in the hall, his face a mask of irritation. Lydia, his young ward, stood trembling at the foot of the stairs, her face pale as moonlight. Inspector Harrow, who had been visiting a neighbour, arrived shortly after Miss Marple, his notebook already in hand. "It was just a fright, nothing more," Ashby said, his voice clipped. "Lydia found something in her room. A silly prank." "No doubt." Miss Marple's eyes flicked to Lydia, noting the girl's clenched hands and wide, fearful eyes. "May I see what she found, Mr. Ashby?" she asked, her tone as gentle as a summer breeze. Ashby hesitated, then nodded curtly. Lydia led them to her room, a small, airy space with lace curtains and a four-poster bed. On the pillow lay a folded note, its edges crumpled as if gripped tightly. Miss Marple unfolded it, her gloved fingers careful not to smudge the ink. Written in harsh, block letters were the words, "Leave St. Mary Mead, or your secrets will be known." Inspector Harrow frowned, taking the note. "This is no prank, Miss Marple. It's a threat." Lydia's voice trembled as she spoke. "I found it just now, when Fishy and I came upstairs. I don't know who would do this." Miss Marple's gaze softened. "Fishy, dear." "My cat," Lydia said, pointing to a tabby curled on the windowsill. She was hissing at the pillow, and that's when I saw the note. Miss Marple nodded, her mind already weaving possibilities. A cat's instincts were not to be ignored. Might have sensed an intruder, but it was the note itself that intrigued her most. Its bluntness suggested urgency, perhaps desperation. Someone wanted Lydia gone, and the timing hours after Miss Marple's discovery in the hidden room felt far from coincidental. "Inspector," she said, her voice low, "might I keep the note for now? I'd like to study it further." Harrow raised an eyebrow but handed it over. "You've got a knack for these things, Miss Marple, but be careful." As they left Lydia's room, Miss Marple tucked the note into her reticule, her thoughts returning to the hidden room, the ledgers, the locked box, Gibbs's nervousness, and now this threat to Lydiate, all pointed to a secret Mr. Ashby was desperate to keep. She resolved to protect Lydia and uncover the truth, starting with that iron box. Its contents, she suspected, would unlock more than just a mystery. The night was still young, and St. Mary Mead was far from quiet. As Miss Marple walked home, the scream's echo lingered in her mind, a clarion call to action. She would need all her wits and perhaps a touch of village gossip to unravel the secrets of Willow Grange. Chapter 7. The threatening note. The morning mist clung to St. Mary Mead like a gossamer veil, softening the edges of the village's tidy cottages and winding lanes. Miss Jane Marple sat by her window, her knitting needles clicking softly, though her mind was far from the pale blue scarf taking shape in her hands. The note, discovered the previous night in Lydia Ashby's trembling fingers lay folded on the table beside her. Its stark block letters sleeve, St. Mary, Mead, or your secrets will be exposed, seemed to pulse with malice, as though the paper itself were alive with the writer's intent. Miss Marple's eyes, sharp despite her years, traced the garden outside where Florence, her young maid, was fussing over a rosebush. The scream from Willow Grange last night had rattled Florence, who had recounted it with wide-eyed fervour, a high, piercing cry that cut through the Manor's heavy silence. Lydia's discovery of the note explained the sound, but it opened a door to deeper questions. Who in this quiet village harboured such venom? And what secrets did Lydia carry that warranted such a threat? The clock on the mantel chimed 9, pulling Miss Marple from her thoughts. She tucked the note into her handbag, slipped on her sensible shoes, and set out for Willow Grange. The village was stirring now, with the baker's boy whistling past, and Mrs. Price from the post office sweeping her stoop. Miss Marple nodded politely, her mind cataloguing the faces and their potential secrets. In a village like St. Mary Mead, everyone knew something, but not everyone spoke it. Willow Grange loomed at the edge of the village, its ivy-clad walls both stately and secretive. Miss Marple knocked, and the door creaked open to reveal Gibbs, the butler, his face pale and his eyes darting. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice tight. "Mrs. Ashby is indisposed this morning." "I shan't disturb her long," Miss Marple replied, her tone mild but firm. "I've come to speak with Inspector Harrow, if he's about." Gibbs hesitated, then stepped aside. "He's in the drawing-room, ma'am." The drawing-room was a study in faded elegance, heavy drapes, polished mahogany, and a fire that did little to warm the chill of suspicion hanging in the air. Inspector Harrow, a stocky man with a moustache that seemed perpetually sceptical, stood by the fireplace, examining the note Miss Marple had given him earlier that morning. Lydia sat on a settee, her hands twisting a handkerchief, her face pale but composed. "Miss Marple," Harrow said, nodding, "you've a knack for turning up at the right moment. This note's a nasty piece of work. Block letters, no signatures, someone's gone to lengths to stay hidden." "Indeed," Miss Marple said, settling into a chair, "but the effort to conceal suggests familiarity. Someone who knows Willow Grange well enough to slip this under Lydia's door." Lydia's eyes flicked up, dark with worry. "I don't know what secrets they mean," she said, her voice low. "I've lived quietly here, helping Charles with his work. I can't imagine who'd want me gone." Miss Marple's gaze softened, but her mind was razor-sharp. Lydia's words rang true, yet there was a tremor in her voice, a shadow of something unspoken. "My dear," she said gently, "sometimes secrets are not ours alone, but tied to those around us. Have you enemies here? Perhaps someone connected to your husband's business?" Lydia shook her head, but her fingers tightened on the handkerchief. Harrow cleared his throat. "I'm inclined to think this is an inside job. The note was found in your bedroom, Mrs. Ashby. No signs of forced entry. Whoever left it had access to the house." Gibbs, lingering by the door, shifted uncomfortably. Miss Marple noted his unease, the way his hands fidgeted at his sides. "Gibbs," she said brightly, "you must know the comings and goings here. Has anyone unusual been about lately?" "No, ma'am," Gibbs said quickly, too quickly. "Just the usual staff and visitors. I've been busy with repair shelves in the library, you know." Miss Marple smiled, her eyes never leaving his face. "Of course. Shelves can be troublesome things, always hiding something when they creak." Gibbs flushed, and Harrow raised an eyebrow but said nothing. The The conversation shifted to the village meeting scheduled that afternoon, where Charles Ashby planned to announce a charity auction to quell rumours about his financial dealings. A bold move, Harrow remarked. He's hoping to paint himself. The philanthropist, no doubt, or distract from something else, Miss Marple said softly, her needles clicking in her mind's rhythm. She rose, promising to return for the meeting, and stepped into the crisp air of the Granger's gardens. As she walked, her eyes caught a faint wisp of smoke curling from behind a hedge. Curious, she followed it to find Clara, the housekeeper, kneeling by a small fire, feeding papers into the flames. "Clara," Miss Marple said, her voice gentle but startling the woman. Clara's hands froze, a singed letter trembling in her grip. Her face, usually composed, was etched with panic. "Miss Marple," Clara gasped, dropping the letter into the fire. It flared briefly, but Miss Marple's quick hand snatched a fragment before it was consumed. "I was just clearing old papers. Nothing important." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled with understanding. "My dear, burning papers is rarely about. Nothing, especially when they're burned in such haste. Might we have a word?" Clara's shoulders slumped, and she nodded, leading Miss Marple to a bench beneath a willow. The village meeting was hours away, and the garden was quiet, save for the rustle of leaves. "I didn't mean to cause trouble," Clara began, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's for Lydia. She's been through enough. And Mr. Ashby, he's not a kind man when crossed." Miss Marple's expression remained serene, but her mind was weaving connections. "You burned letters to protect Lydia," she said. "Not a question, but a statement. Letters that might anger Mr. Ashby." Clara's eyes filled with tears. They were old letters, from before Lydia came here. "I thought they'd only bring trouble. Mr. Ashby's been under strain with the Meridian Trust business. I didn't want Lydia caught in it." Miss Marple held up the singed fragment she'd saved. The words were faint, but clear. "Safe deposit." She tucked it into her handbag, her mind racing. "Clara, you've done what you thought best. But secrets, like fires, have a way of spreading if not handled carefully. Will you trust me with the truth?" Clara hesitated, then nodded. "There was one letter I couldn't burn. It's hidden in my room, under the floorboard. It mentions a safe deposit, but I don't know what it means. I only wanted to keep Lydia safe." Miss Marple patted her hand. "You've done well to tell me. Keep that letter safe, and say nothing to Mr. Ashby. We'll sort this out together." The village meeting was held in the church hall, a modest space filled with the hum of gossip and the clink of teacups. Charles Ashby stood at the front, his polished demeanour masking a faint strain in his smile. "Friends," he began, "I know there's been talk about my affairs. Let's put it to rest. Willow Grange will host a charity auction next week, with proceeds to the village school. Let's show St. Mary Mead's spirit." The crowd murmured approval, but Miss Marple's eyes were elsewhere. Clara's absence nagged at her, and the fragment in her handbag felt heavier with each of Ashby's words. She slipped out, unnoticed, and returned to Willow Grange, where Clara waited in the housekeeper's small room. The letter, retrieved from its hiding place, was brittle but intact. It was addressed to Lydia, in a hand Miss Marple didn't recognize, and spoke of a safe deposit holding proof of his deceit. The signature was smudged, but the intent was clear. Someone had wanted Lydia to know of Ashby's wrongs. Miss Marple's heart quickened. The Meridian Trust, the hidden room, the ledger she was closing in on something vast. A web of deceit spun by Charles Ashby. But the note, the scream, Clara's fear, they pointed to a more immediate danger. She tucked the letter away, her resolve hardening. The auction would be the next step, a stage where Ashby's mask might slip further as she left Willow Grange. The sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the village. Florence met her at the gate, breathless. "Miss Marple, I heard something odd at the meeting. Mrs. Bantry said she saw Gibbs talking to a stranger in the lane last night. After the scream, he looked frightened." Miss Marple's lips curved slightly. "Did he, now? Well, Florence, it seems our Mr. Gibbs has more to tell us, and I suspect the auction will reveal more than Mr. Ashby intends." That night, by her fire, Miss Marple spread out the note, the letter fragment, and her knitting. The pieces were falling into place, each thread of suspicion weaving into a pattern only she could see. The safe deposit was the key, but Ashby's desperation and Gibbs's fear-suggested time was short. She would need to tread carefully, but Miss Marple had never been one too shy from a challenge. St. Mary Mead's secrets were unravelling, and she would see them laid bare. Chapter 8. The Auction's Secret. The morning of the charity auction at Willow Grange dawned crisp and golden, with St. Mary Mead buzzing like a hive stirred by a curious child. The village green, usually a quiet expanse of grass, was transformed into a carnival of activity. Stalls draped in bunting offered homemade jams, knitted scarves, and jars of Mrs. Bantry's infamous pickled onions, which were rumoured to have once sent a visiting vicar into a coughing fit. At the centre of it all stood Willow Grange, its ivy-clad facade gleaming under the autumn sun, as if the manor itself were putting on a show to rival the auction within Miss Jane Marple, her black lace mittens tucked neatly into her handbag, stood at the edge of the crowd, her sharp eyes scanning the scene. She wore her usual tweed suit, the colour of damp heather, and a hat adorned with a single pheasant feather, which bobbed slightly as she tilted her head to observe. To the casual onlooker, she was just another elderly spinster, perhaps there to bid on a chipped teapot or a second-hand novel. But Miss Marple's mind was far from teapots. She was thinking of the letter fragment Clara had handed over, its singed edge whispering of a safe deposit, and secrets buried deeper than the roots of Willow Grange's ancient oaks. The auction was Ashby's idea, a grand gesture to dispel rumours, as he'd put it at the village meeting. Miss Marple had noted the way his voice had strained, like a violin string stretched too tight, when he spoke of unity and charity. She'd also noticed Clara's absence that evening, a detail that hung in her mind like a loose thread on a favourite shawl. Now, as she watched Ashby stride across the lawn, shaking hands with villagers and flashing a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, she felt the familiar prickle of suspicion. He was playing a part, and she intended to find out why. The auction was set up in the manor's great hall, a cavernous room with oak-panelled walls and a chandelier that glittered like a frozen waterfall. Rows of chairs faced a polished mahogany table, where items donated by villagers awaited their moment under the auctioneer's gavel. There were silver candlesticks, a set of leather-bound Dickens novels, and a peculiar oil painting of a horse that looked more like a disgruntled cow. But Miss Marple's attention was drawn to an antique clock, its brass face etched with Roman numerals, standing proudly at the table's centre. It was an odd piece for Ashby to part with, given his penchant for collecting relics of grandeur. She recalled the letter fragment's mention of a safe deposit, and wondered if the clock held more than time. As the crowd filed in, Miss Marple took a seat near the back, her knitting bag resting on her lap like a loyal pet. Mrs. Langley the village's self-appointed arbiter of taste, swept in wearing a fur stole that looked as if it had been wrestled from a bear. She settled in the front row, her eyes gleaming with the prospect of acquiring something to boast about at the next Women's Institute meeting. Beside her sat Mr. Gibbs, Ashby's groundskeeper, his broad shoulders hunched as if he carried the weight of the manor itself. Miss Marple noted his fidgeting hands, the way his fingers twisted the brim of his cap, and filed it away for later. The auctioneer, a wiry man named Mr. Pym, with a moustache that seemed to have a life of its own, took his place at the table. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice booming like a foghorn, "we gather today for a noble cause, the restoration of St. Mary Mead's church roof. Let's open our hearts and our purses." The crowd chuckled, and the bidding began. A set of crystal goblets went to Mrs. Bantry for a modest sum, though Miss Marple suspected she'd only bid to avoid another year of pickled onion jokes. A porcelain shepherdess figurine sparked a surprising duel between the postmistress and the butcher's wife, ending with the latter's triumphant bid of 10 shillings. Through it all, Miss Marple's eyes kept drifting to the clock. Ashby, standing near the auctioneer, seemed unusually attentive to it, his fingers drumming against his thigh as Pym described its exquisite craftsmanship and historical charm. When the clock came up for bid, the room hushed. "A fine piece," Pym declared, "from the late 18th century, with a mechanism as precise as the day it was made. Shall we start at £5? Mrs. Langley's hand shot up like a flagpole. £5, she called, her voice dripping with confidence. 6, countered Mr. Harrow, the inspector, who had slipped into the hall unnoticed. Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. Harrow wasn't the sort to bid on antiques, and she suspected he was here for more than charity. 7, Mrs. Langley snapped, glaring at Harrow as if he'd insulted her lineage. The bidding climbed to £12, with Mrs. Langley emerging victorious. As Pym's gavel fell, Ashby's smile faltered, a flicker of unease crossing his face. Miss Marple leaned forward, her knitting needles clicking softly. Something about the clock was important for Ashby to let it go so easily. After the auction, the crowd spilled onto the lawn for tea and scones, served by Florence, Miss Marple's maid, who was earning extra shillings for the day. Miss Marple approached Mrs. Langley, who was admiring her new acquisition, as if it were a crown jewel, a splendid purchase. "Mrs. Langley," Miss Marple said, her voice as gentle as a summer breeze, "might I have a closer look? I've always admired such craftsmanship." Mrs. Langley, flattered, gestured to the clock, now resting on a table under a marquee. "Of course, Miss Marple, isn't it divine? I shall have it on my mantelpiece by supper." Miss Marple peered at the clock, her fingers tracing its brass edges. The face was slightly tarnished, but the wood was polished to a mirror-like sheen. As she tilted her head, she noticed a faint seam along the base, barely visible unless one knew to look. Her heart quickened. A hidden compartment, perhaps. She glanced around, ensuring no one was watching, and pressed gently on the seam. A soft click sounded, and a small panel sprang open, revealing a hollow space just large enough for a key. Before she could reach inside, a shadow fell across the table. Miss Marple, it was Gibbs, his voice gruff but unsteady. "I was just checking the clock. Mr. Ashby asked me to make sure it's in working order." Miss Marple straightened, her expression serene but her mind racing. Gibbs's eyes darted to the open panel, and a bead of sweat glistened on his brow. "How thoughtful of Mr. Ashby," she said, her tone as warm as if she were complimenting his gardening. but it seems perfectly fine. Such a curious piece, don't you think, almost as if it's hiding something. Gibbs's hands twitched, and he muttered something about needing to fetch a tool. As he hurried off, Miss Marple slipped her fingers into the compartment and retrieved a small, ornate key, its head engraved with a tiny crest. She tucked it into her sleeve, her face betraying nothing, and closed the panel just as Mrs. Langley returned with a scone in hand. "Oh, Miss Marple, you're still admiring it," Mrs. Langley said, oblivious to the drama unfolding. "I do hope it keeps time, as well as Mr. Pym claims." "I'm sure it will," Miss Marple replied, her smile as innocent as a daisy. "Some things are more reliable than they appear." As the afternoon waned, Miss Marple lingered near the marquee, watching Gibbs from a distance. He was back at the clock, his movements furtive as he prodded the base. When he realized the compartment was empty, his face paled, and he cast a panicked glance around the lawn. Miss Marple's lips pursed. Gibbs's desperation was as clear as the church bell on Sunday. Loyalty to Ashby, perhaps, or fear of what Ashby might do if the key was lost. She found Inspector Harrow near the tea stall, sipping a cup with the air of a man who'd rather be anywhere else. "Inspector," she said, drawing him aside, "I believe Mr. Gibbs has taken an unusual interest in Mrs. Langley's clock. You might wish to have a word with him." Harrow's eyes narrowed. "Gibbs, what's he up to?" "I couldn't say," Miss Marple replied, her tone light but her gaze steady. "But I've found people often act strangely when they're guarding someone else's secrets." Harrow nodded, setting down his cup. He approached Gibbs, who was now pretending to adjust a tent peg, and invited him for a chat at the station. Gibbs went reluctantly, his shoulders slumped, and Miss Marple watched them go, the key a reassuring weight in her sleeve. She didn't mention it to Harrow not yet. The key was a piece of the puzzle, and she needed to know where it fit before anyone else laid claim to it. That evening, as the village settled into its usual quiet, Miss Marple sat in her cottage, knitting. By the fire, the key lay on her tea table, glinting in the lamplight. She thought of the safe deposit, the letter fragment, and Ashby's nervous smile. The clock had been a distraction, a sleight of hand, but the key was real. It unlocked something, perhaps. A box, perhaps a truth. She would find out, but not tonight. Tonight, she would let Ashby wonder, let Gibbs stew, and let the village hum with the gossip of the day's events. As she sipped her tea, Florence burst in, her apron askew. "Miss Marple, they're saying Mr. Gibbs was taken to the station. Is it true he tried to steal something from the auction?" Miss Marple's needles paused. "Not stealing, Florence, dear. Protecting, perhaps, or hiding. People do all sorts of things when they're afraid." Florence's eyes widened, but Miss Marple only smiled and returned to her knitting. The key was safe, Gibbs was in Harrow's hands, and the mystery of Willow Grange was unravelling thread by thread. Tomorrow, she would find the lock that fit the key and the truth that lay beyond it. Chapter 9. The Safe Deposit. The morning mist clung to St. Mary Mead like a gossamer veil, softening the edges of its thatched roofs and cobblestone paths. Miss Jane Marple stood at her cottage window, her knitting abandoned on the table, her eyes fixed on the distant silhouette of Willow Grange. The key she had found in the antique clock's hidden compartment weighed heavily in her pocket, its cold metal a silent promise of secrets yet to be unveiled. She had spent the previous evening turning it over in her hands, her mind weaving through the threads of the mystery that had begun with a dropped handkerchief and now pointed to a London bank and a safe deposit box registered to L. Ashby. The village was abuzz with the charity auction's aftermath, but Miss Marple's thoughts were elsewhere. The key, small and unassuming, was a tangible link to the Meridian Trust frauder scheme that had ruined lives, including that of Eleanor Price, whose name had surfaced like a ghost from the past. Miss Marple's secret weapon, her uncanny ability to see patterns in human behavior, told her that the key was more than a tool. It was a catalyst, poised to unravel Leonard Ashby's carefully constructed facade. She adjusted her shawl and set out for the station, her steps brisk despite the damp chill. The train to London was a rare excursion for her, but necessary. She had telephoned Inspector Harrow the night before, her voice calm but firm, insisting that the key warranted immediate investigation. Harrow, a practical man with a grudging respect for Miss Marple's instincts, had agreed to meet her at the bank, though not without a hint of skepticism. "A key's only as good as what it opens, Miss Marple," he had said. She had smiled into the receiver, knowing that what it opened would change everything. The journey to London was uneventful, the train rattling through fields and villages that seemed untouched by the intrigues of St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple sat by the window, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her mind sifting through the clues, the coded letters, the locket engraved, with E.P. Clara Wren's trembling hands, and now the key. Each piece was a stitch in a larger pattern, and she was determined to see it whole at the bank. A dear building of grey stone in the heart of the city. Inspector Harrow was waiting, his hat tilted slightly against the drizzle. "You're certain about this, Miss Marple?" he asked, his tone more curious than dismissive. He was a tall man, with sharp eyes that missed little, but he lacked the patience to parse the subtleties of human nature as Miss Marple did. "Quite certain, Inspector," she replied, her voice mild but resolute. "The key belongs to a safe deposit box registered to Mr. Ashby. I suspect it holds the truth about the Meridian Trust Stand, perhaps about Eleanor Price." The bank manager, a Mr. Pritchard, was a fussy man with a penchant for protocol. He eyed the key with suspicion, then Miss Marple and Harrow with even greater wariness. "This is highly irregular," he said, adjusting his spectacles. "The box is registered to a Mr. Leonard Ashby, without his presence or legal documentation." Harrow produced a warrant, its crisp edges silencing Pritchard's objections. "We have reason to believe the contents are evidence in a fraud investigation," he said. "Open it, please." Pritchard led them to the vault, a cavernous room lined with gleaming steel boxes. The key slid into the lock of box 472 with a satisfying click, and the door swung open to reveal a stack of documents, neatly bound with a red ribbon. Miss Marple's heart quickened as she glimpsed the top page. Marked with the Meridian Trust's logo, a stylized compass rose that seemed almost mocking in its elegance. Harrow untied the ribbon, spreading the papers on a nearby table. There were ledgers, contracts, and correspondence, all detailing a web of financial deceit. The Meridian Trust, it appeared, had been a house of cards, promising investors wealth while funneling their money into Ashby's private accounts. Names leaped from the Page's investors, many of them elderly or vulnerable, who had lost everything. Among them was Eleanor Price, listed as a principal investor whose funds had been reallocated to an offshore account. "This is damning," Harrow muttered, his fingers tracing a column of figures. "Ashby's been playing a dangerous game." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes scanning a letter signed by Ashby himself, promising Eleanor returns that never materialized. He prayed on. "Trust," she said softly, "and trust, Inspector, is a fragile thing." They returned to St. Mary Mead that afternoon, the documents secured in Harrow's briefcase. Miss Marple, however, carried something else, a renewed sense of purpose. The safe deposit box had confirmed Ashby's guilt, but it also raised questions about Eleanor Price's fate. Was she truly gone, as the village rumors suggested, or was there more to her disappearance? Back in St. Mary Mead, the village was preparing for the evening's harvest supper, a modest affair in the church hall. Miss Marple declined to attend, her mind too occupied to enjoy the chatter and cider. Instead, she invited Lydia Price, the woman claiming to be Eleanor's cousin, to her cottage for tea. Lydia arrived promptly at 4, her dark eyes shadowed with worry, her hands clutching a worn reticule. "Miss Marple," Lydia began, her voice low, "I heard you went to London. Did you find anything?" Miss Marple poured the tea, her movements deliberate. "We found documents, Miss Price. Documents that tell a rather ugly story about Mr. Ashby and the Meridian Trust, but I suspect you know more about that than you've let on." Lydia's cup rattled against its saucer. I told you, Eleanor was my cousin. She invested everything in that scheme, and when it collapsed, she vanished. I came here to find out what happened." Miss Marple's eyes softened, but her gaze was piercing. "My dear, I've lived long enough to know when someone is hiding the truth, not out of deceit, but out of love. Eleanor wasn't your cousin. Was she? She was your sister." Lydia's breath caught, and for a moment she seemed on the verge of flight. Then her shoulders sagged, and tears welled in her eyes. "How did you know?" "Little things," Miss Marple said gently. "The way you speak of her, the locket engraved with EP. It's not just a cousin's concern, it's deeper, more personal. Tell me, Lydia, what happened to Eleanor?" Lydia hesitated, then spoke in a rush, as if unburdening a weight she had carried too long. "Eleanor was my older sister. She was brilliant, trusting. She met Ashby in London, fell for his charm. He convinced her to invest her inheritance in the Meridian Trust. When it failed, she confronted him, and he threatened her. She fled, changed her name, and wrote to me, begging me to keep her secret. I came here to find proof of his fraud, to make him pay." Miss Marple nodded, her mind fitting this new piece into the puzzle. "And Clara Wren? She knows about Eleanor, doesn't she?" Lydia's eyes widened. "Clara was Eleanor's friend. She worked for Ashby, saw what he was doing. She's been helping me, but she's terrified of him." The conversation was interrupted by a knock at the door. "Florence, Miss Marple." Maid entered, her face flushed with excitement. "Miss Marple, you'll never believe it. Young Tom Carter, the baker's boy, says he saw Mr. Gibbs digging by the lake at Willow Grange last night. Looked like he was burying something. He did." Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. "Did he? Now? Thank you, Florence. That's most illuminating." After Lydia left, promising to stay in touch, Miss Marple sat by her fire, her knitting resumed but her mind racing. Gibbs, Ashby's brusque associate, had been caught tampering with the auction clock, and now he was digging by the lake. Her understanding of patterns, how people repeated their mistakes, how fear drove them to act suggested another clue was hidden there, waiting to be unearthed. She telephoned Harrow again, her voice calm but urgent. "Inspector, I believe you. Should search the grounds of Willow Grange, near the lake. Mr. Gibbs has been busy, and I suspect he's left something for us to find." Harrow, to his credit, acted swiftly. By dusk, he and 2 constables were at Willow Grange, their lanterns casting eerie shadows across the lake's glassy surface. Miss Marple, bundled in her shawl, watched from a discreet distance, her presence unnoticed by the villagers who had gathered to gawk. The search was methodical, the constable's spades turning up damp earth until one struck something solid. Harrow knelt, brushing away dirt to reveal a small metal box, its surface rusted but intact. Inside was a locket, identical to the one from the village fete, engraved with Eep. A murmur rippled through the onlookers, but Miss Marple's lips curved into a faint smile. The locket was no coincidence, it was a thread, tying Eleanor Price to Ashby, to the lake, to the fraud. That had shattered her life, as Harrow sealed the box for evidence. Miss Marple slipped away, her mind already turning to the next step. The locket confirmed Eleanor's connection to Ashby, but it also raised new questions. Why bury it? What was Gibbs hiding, and on whose orders? The safe deposit documents had exposed Ashby's greed, but the locket suggested something deeper. Personal betrayal, perhaps even a crime beyond fraud. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple sat by the fire, the key still in her pocket, the locket's image vivid in her mind. She thought of Eleanor, driven to ruin, and Lydia, risking everything to right that wrong. She thought of Clara, caught between loyalty and fear, and Gibbs, whose desperation marked him as a pawn in Ashby's game. The pattern was clearer now, but not complete. There were still threads to pull, and Miss Marple, with her quiet wisdom and unerring instinct, was ready to unravel them all. Chapter 10. The second locket. The morning mist clung to St. Mary Mead like a gossamer veil, softening the edges of the village's stone cottages and the spire of St. Mary's Church. Miss Marple, wrapped in her favourite woolen shawl, sat by her window, her knitting needles clicking softly as she contemplated the locket found by the lake. Its delicate silver filigree, engraved with Eepy, was identical to the one from the fete, a twin relic of Eleanor Price's shadowed past. The discovery had sent ripples through Willow Grange, and Miss Marple's keen mind was already piecing together the threads of a deeper truth. The locket was no mere trinket, was a tether to secrets Ashby desperately wanted buried. She set her knitting aside and adjusted her spectacles, her eyes sharp despite the early hour. The locket's significance gnawed at her, its twin existence suggesting a deliberate act of concealment. Clara's distress when shown the locket during Inspector Harrow's questioning had been palpable, her hands trembling, her gaze darting like a trapped sparrow. Miss Marple knew that look, the weight of a secret too heavy to carry alone. Clara knew more than she'd let on, and today Miss Marple intended to find out what. The village was stirring as she made her way to Dollycott, Mrs. Bantry's ivy-clad home, for afternoon tea. The walk was brisk, the air carrying the scent of damp earth and late roses. Miss Marple's mind wandered to Eleanor Price, Lydia's sister, whose name had surfaced like a ghost from the past. The locket, the Meridian Trust, fraught Ashby's. Polished charmel pointed to a man who wove deception as deftly as she knitted scarves. But what had Clara's role been? And why, Miss Marple wondered, had Eleanor vanished after her engagement to Ashby? Mrs. Bantry's drawing room was a cosy haven of chintz and polished mahogany, the fire crackling as she poured tea from a silver pot. "Jane, you've got that look," she said, her eyes twinkling with mischief, like a cat watching a mouse hole. "What's brewing in that mind of yours?" Miss Marple smiled, accepting a delicate china cup. "Oh, Dolly, just a little puzzle. You remember Eleanor Price, don't you? The young woman engaged to Mr. Ashby some years ago." Mrs. Bantry's eyebrows shot up, her teaspoon pausing mid-stir. "Eleanor. My goodness, that was ages ago. Lovely girl, but too quiet. I always thought, for a man like Ashby, they were engaged, weren't they? Then she just vanished, broke it off, and left St. Mary Mead without a word. Why do you ask? Miss Marple sipped her tea, her expression serene but her mind racing. A locket was found, you see, engraved with her initials. It stirred up some old questions. Did you ever hear what became of her? Mrs. Bantry leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. Not much, I'm afraid. There were rumours, you know how villagers talk. Some said she ran off to London, heartbroken. Others whispered Ashby had done something dreadful, though no one could prove it. I always thought she was hiding from something or someone. Miss Marple nodded, filing the information away. And Clara. She was close to Eleanor, wasn't she? Oh yes, Mrs. Bantry said, reaching for a scone. Thick as thieves, those two. Clara was devastated when Eleanor left. I remember her moping about for weeks, though she never said why. You don't think Clara's mixed up in this locket business, do you? I think, Miss Marple said carefully, that Clara knows more than she's telling. And I mean to. Find out what? The tea concluded with Mrs. Bantry promising to keep her ears open, and Miss Marple set off for Willow Grange, her umbrella tapping the cobblestones. The manor loomed ahead, its gables sharp against the grey sky. She'd arranged to meet Clara under the guise of returning a borrowed book, a flimsy excuse. But one Clara wouldn't question. Miss Marple's strength lay in her unassuming nature. People let their guard down around a frail old lady with a penchant for knitting. Clara met her at the manor's heavy oak door, her face pale and her apron slightly askew. Miss Marple, how kind of you to come, she said, her voice strained. The book, did you enjoy it? Oh, very much, Miss Marple replied, handing over a worn copy of Pride and Prejudice. But I wondered if we might have a little chat about Eleanor. Clara's eyes widened, and she glanced over her shoulder, as if expecting Ashby to materialize from the shadows. Eleanor, why? Bring her up now. Miss Marple stepped closer, her voice gentle but firm. Because of the locket, my dear. The one found by the lake. It's hers, isn't it? And you know why it was hidden? Clara's hands twisted in her apron, her knuckles white. I don't know what you mean, she stammered, but her eyes betrayed her flickering with guilt, fear, and something deeper. Loyalty, perhaps. Miss Marple guided Clara to a bench in the manor's rose garden, where the air was thick with the scent of blooms and the hum of bees. Clara, she said softly, I've seen many young women like you carrying burdens they shouldn't. You helped Eleanor, didn't you, to hide that locket? Clara's resolve crumbled like dry leaves. She sank onto the bench, her shoulders shaking. I didn't want to, she whispered, but Eleanor was so frightened. She said Ashby had threatened her, said if she told anyone about the Meridian Trust, he'd ruin her. She gave me the locket to hide, said it was proof of what he'd done. I buried it by the lake, where no one would find it. Miss Marple's heart quickened, but her face remained calm. Proof of what, Clara? Clara's voice dropped to a near whisper. The fraud, Eleanor said. The locket held a note, something about the trust's accounts. She was going to take it to the police, but Ashby found out. He scared her so badly she ran, and she's alive. Miss Marple asked, her tone steady but urgent. Clara nodded, tears brimming. She's in Chipping Cleghorn, under a new name, Mary Evans. I've seen her once or twice, when Ashby's away. She's terrified he'll find her. Miss Marple patted Clara's hand, her mind alight with possibilities. The locket, the note, Eleanor's survival it, all pointed to a web of deceit spun by Ashby, with Clara and Eleanor as its unwilling threads. You've done well to tell me, Clara. Now, will you help me meet her? Eleanor's story could be the key to stopping Ashby. Clara hesitated, then nodded. I'll send word to her. But please, Miss Marple, be careful. Ashby's not what he seems. The arrangements were made swiftly. Clara sent a discreet note to Chipping Cleghorn, and by the next afternoon, Miss Marple was on a train, her knitting bag tucked under her arm. The journey was short, the countryside blurring past in shades of green and gold. Chipping was a bustling market town, its streets alive with vendors and shoppers. Miss Marple followed Clara's directions to a modest boarding house, where a woman with Eleanor's dark eyes and cautious demeanour opened the door. Miss Marple, the woman asked, her voice low. Clara said you'd come. Indeed, my dear, Miss Marple said, stepping inside. The room was sparse but tidy, with a single photograph on the mantel, a younger Eleanor with Lydia, their smiles bright. I'm here about the locket, and Ashby. Eleanor's face tightened, but she gestured to a chair. I knew this day would come, she said. I've been running from him for years. Over tea, Eleanor's story poured out. She'd met Ashby as a young woman, charmed by his ambition and promises of wealth. They'd been engaged, but as she learned of the Meridian Trust's shady dealings, false investments, siphoned funds, she confronted him. He turned cold, Eleanor said, her voice trembling. Said if I spoke a word, he'd make sure no one believed me. The locket was my insurance and note inside listed account. Numbers he'd hidden. I gave it to Clara to bury when I fled. Miss Marple listened, her mind slotting each detail into place. And the second locket? She asked. Eleanor's eyes darkened. A decoy. I had two made, one with the note, one empty. I wore the empty one to throw Ashby off. He never knew which was which. Miss Marple nodded, impressed by Eleanor's cunning. You've been very brave, my dear, but we must act now. The documents in the London bank, your note, led us to them. Ashby's fraud is unraveling, but we need you too. Testify. Eleanor's hands shook, but her jaws set with determination. I'll do it, for Lydia, for everyone he's hurt. The return to St. Mary Mead was quiet, Miss Marple's thoughts a whirl of plans. Eleanor would stay hidden until the time was right, but the locket's secret had unlocked a path forward. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple found Inspector Harrow waiting, his face grim. Jane, he said, we've had a development. Gibbs was seen near the manor last night, acting strange, and there's talk in the village of Ashby's planning to leave for London tomorrow. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. Then we must move quickly, Inspector. Eleanor is alive, and she's ready to speak, but we need to keep Ashby here. Harrow nodded. I'll have my men watch him, but what's your plan? Miss Marple smiled, a glint of mischief in her eyes. Oh, just a little village gossip, Inspector. Spread the right rumour, and Ashby will come to us. That evening, at the village inn, Miss Marple shared a carefully crafted tidbit with Mrs. Bantry, knowing it would spread like wildfire. I heard, she whispered, that the safe deposit documents are at the police station, under lock and key. By nightfall, the rumour had reached Willow Grange. Miss Marple, watching from her window, saw a shadow move toward the manor's gates. The trap was set, and Ashby's greed would lead him straight into it. Chapter 11. The trap is set. The morning mist clung to St. Mary Mead like a whispered secret, curling around the hedgerows and softening the edges of Willow Grange's imposing silhouette. Miss Jane Marple, bundled in her sensible wool coat and clutching her worn leather handbag, stepped lightly along the gravel path toward the village hall. Her eyes, sharp as ever behind her spectacles, scanned the familiar lanes, noting the flutter of curtains in Mrs. Price's cottage and the hurried stride of young Tom Carter delivering the morning post. The village hummed with its usual rhythm, but beneath it, a current of unease. Rippled Ashby's shadow loomed large, and Miss Marple was determined to bring it into the light. Inside the village hall, the air smelled of polished wood and faintly of lavender from Mrs. Bantry's ever-present sachets. Eleanor Price, now living under the name Ellen Page, sat across from Miss Marple at a small table, her hands twisting a handkerchief into knots. Her face, though lined with years of fear, held a flicker of resolve, kindled by Miss Marple's quiet encouragement the day before. "He threatened me, Miss Marple," Eleanor said, her voice low but steady. "Not just with words. Ashby said he'd ruin me, my family, anyone who stood in his way. The Meridian Trust was his empire, and I was just collateral." She paused, her eyes darting to the window as if expecting Ashby's shadow to materialize. "When I tried to leave, he sent a man to my lodging. I still remember the sound of boots on the stairs." Miss Marple leaned forward, her knitting needle still in her lap. "My dear, you've carried this alone for too long. But you're not alone now. We'll make him show his hand." Her voice was soft, but there was steel in it, the kind that came from years of unraveling human nature's darkest threads. Eleanor nodded, her lips trembling. "What do you propose?" "A trap," Miss Marple said simply. "Ashby's strength is his greed, and greed, you see, is a predictable thing. Like my nephew Raymond's dog chasing a squirrel. Once it starts, it can't stop." She smiled faintly, but her eyes were alight with purpose. "We'll spread a rumor that the safe deposit documents are at the police station, not safely locked away in London. If Ashby believes his secrets are within reach, he'll act. And when he does, Inspector Harrow will be waiting." Ellen's eyes widened. "You think he'll try to steal them?" "I think," Miss Marple said, adjusting her shawl, "that a man like Ashby cannot resist the lure of control. It's his nature, you see. Like Mrs. Clement's cat with a ball of yarn once it's dangled, he'll pounce." The village dance that evening was a whirl of colour and chatter. The hall transformed with paper lanterns and bunting in cheerful reds and golds. The local band played a lively reel, and couples spun across the polished floor, their laughter mingling with the clink of teacups and the rustle of taffeta. Miss Marple sat near the refreshment table, her knitting in her lap, her eyes scanning. The crowd, Mrs. Bantry, ever the enthusiastic gossip, was already at work, her voice carrying over the music as she leaned toward Mrs. Langley. "Did you hear, my dear?" Mrs. Bantry said, her eyes wide with feigned surprise. "They say those dreadful documents from the Meridian Trust are at the police station, just sitting there. Imagine all of Ashby's secrets out in the open like that." Mrs. Langley, her brooch gleaming under the lantern light, gasped. "At the station? Why, that's terribly careless. Anyone could walk in and take them." Miss Marple's lips twitched. Mrs. Bantry was playing her part splendidly, sowing the seeds of the rumour with just the right mix of shock and intrigue. Across the room, Ashby stood near the punch bowl, his polished smile fixed in place as he chatted with the vicar. But Miss Marple noticed the way his hand tightened round his glass, the slight tilt of his head as Mrs. Bantry's words reached him. He was listening. She glanced at Inspector Harrow, who stood near the door, his broad frame unobtrusive but alert. Their eyes met briefly, and he gave a subtle nod. The trap was set as the band struck up a waltz. Miss Marple rose, her movements unhurried, and approached Lydia, who stood alone near a window, her face pale. The young woman's eyes darted nervously, and Miss Marple noted the faint tremble in her hands. "Lydia, my dear," Miss Marple said gently, "you look as if you've seen a ghost. Come, sit with me a moment." Lydia hesitated, then followed Miss Marple to a quiet corner. "I can't stop thinking about that note," she whispered. "Whoever wrote it, they're watching me. I feel it." Miss Marple patted her hand. "Fear is a heavy burden, but you're stronger than it. We're close to the truth now, and I promise you, no harm will come while I'm here." Her voice was calm, but her mind was racing, piecing together the threads: Lydia's fear, Eleanor's story, Ashby's agitation. The note had been a warning, but to Miss Marple it was also a clue, a sign that someone was desperate to keep Lydia silent. As the dance continued, Miss Marple kept Ashby in her peripheral vision. He was moving now, slipping through the crowd toward the door, his movements too deliberate to be casual. She caught Harrow's eye again, and he nodded, slipping out after Ashby. The rumour had taken root. The night was cool, the stars sharp against the inky sky as Miss Marple stepped outside, her shawl drawn tight. The village was quiet, save for the distant strains of the band and the occasional hoot of an owl. She made her way toward the police station, a small stone building at the edge of the green, its single lantern casting a weak glow. Harrow had promised to keep watch, and she trusted his diligence, but Miss Marple's instincts told her to be present. Human nature, she knew, was unpredictable, and traps could spring in unexpected ways. She paused in the shadow of a yew tree, her small figure blending into the darkness. The station's door was ajar, a sliver of light spilling onto the path. A figure moved inside, too slight to be Harrow, too furtive to be innocent. Miss Marple's heart quickened, but she remained still, her eyes narrowing as the figure emerged, clutching something in its hand. It was Gibbs, his face pale under the lantern's glow, his movements jerky as he glanced over his shoulder. Before he could flee, Harrow stepped from the shadows, his voice calm but firm. "Going somewhere, Gibbs?" Gibbs froze, his hand tightening. Around a glove his own, Miss Marple noted, the same one he'd worn at the auction. I was just checking the lock," Gibbs stammered. "Mr. Ashby asked me to make sure the station was secure." Harrow's eyes narrowed. "At midnight, with a glove in your hand and the door half open?" Miss Marple stepped forward, her voice gentle but cutting through the tension. "Mr. Gibbs, you've always been loyal to Mr. Ashby, haven't you? But loyalty can blind us to what's right. Tell me, why did he promise you to risk so much?" Gibbs's shoulders slumped, his bravado crumbling. He said he'd make it worth my while, said those papers would ruin him, and I had to get them. I didn't want to, but he's got a way of making you feel you owe him." Harrow took the glove, examining it under the lantern. "This yours, Gibbs?" Gibbs nodded, his face ashen. "I didn't take anything. I swear it. I couldn't find the papers." Miss Marple's eyes softened, but her mind was sharp. "You've done no great harm yet, Mr. Gibbs, but you must tell Inspector Harrow everything. The truth is the only way out now." Back at Willow Grange the next morning, Miss Marple sat in the drawing room, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically. As she waited for Harrow to finish questioning Gibbs, Clara hovered near the window, her hands twisting a dishcloth, her eyes darting to the door. Miss Marple noted the tension in her posture, the way her gaze lingered on the garden where she'd burned those papers. "Clara," Miss Marple said softly, "you've been protecting someone, haven't you? Not just Lydia, but Eleanor too. It's a heavy weight, carrying others' secrets." Clara's eyes filled with tears. "I didn't mean to lie, Miss Marple. But Eleanor, she's been through so much. If Ashby knew she was alive, he'd never stop hunting her." Miss Marple nodded, her voice gentle but firm. "You've done what you thought was right, but the truth must come out now. Eleanor is safe, and Ashby's time is running short. Tell me, is there anything else you've kept hidden?" Clara hesitated, then reached into her apron pocket, pulling out a small, singed fragment of paper. "I couldn't burn this one. It felt important." She handed it to Miss Marple, who unfolded it carefully. The fragment bore a single line: "Meridian Trust, Final Transfer, 1928. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. "You've done well. Clara, this may be the final piece we need." By midday, Harrow returned, his face grim but satisfied. "Gibbs talked," he said, sitting across from Miss Marple in her cottage. "Ashby paid him to bury that locket by the lake and to try for the documents last night. He's scared, Miss Marple, scared enough to make mistakes." Miss Marple nodded, her fingers still working the knitting needles. "Fear and greed, Inspector. They're two sides of the same coin. Ashby's unraveling, and with Gibbs's testimony and this fragment, we're close to the truth. But we must be careful. A cornered man is a dangerous one." Harrow leaned forward. "What's our next move?" Miss Marple smiled, her eyes bright with the thrill of the chase. "We let Ashby believe he's safe for now, but we watch him. Inspector, closely. The net is tightening, and he'll make his final mistake soon enough." As Harrow left, Miss Marple settled back in her chair, her mind already spinning the next thread of the trap. The glove, the fragment, Eleanor's story, they were all pieces of a puzzle, and she was close to seeing the whole picture. Outside, the village carried on, unaware of the drama unfolding in its heart. But Miss Marple knew that St. Mary Mead's peace would soon be restored, because human nature, for all its flaws, could never outwit the quiet persistence of truth. Chapter 12. The confession. The morning light filtered through the heavy curtains of Willow Grange, casting long shadows across the polished oak floors. Miss Marple sat in a high-backed chair in the drawing-room, her knitting needles clicking softly, a rhythm as steady as her thoughts. Her eyes, sharp and unyielding despite her age, darted toward the garden where Clara moved with furtive steps, a bundle of papers clutched against her chest. Smoke curled upward from a small fire near the rose bushes, its acrid scent drifting through the half-open window. Miss Marple's lips pressed into a thin line. Clara was burning something again, and this time, it wasn't just letters. The air in St. Mary Mead had grown taut over the past weeks, like a violin string wound too tightly. The village, usually a haven of gossip over teacups and scones, buzzed with unease. The discovery of the second locket by the lake, engraved with EP, had confirmed Eleanor Price's connection to Ashby's schemes, and Gibbs's clumsy attempt to break into the police station had only deepened the mystery. Miss Marple's mind turned over the pieces, the Meridian Trust ledgers, the threatening note to Lydia, the key hidden in the antique clock, and now Clara's secretive fires. Each clue was a thread in a tapestry she was determined to unravel. She set her knitting aside and rose, smoothing her tweed skirt. The drawing-room, with its ornate mantel and faded tapestries, felt like a stage waiting for its actors. Miss Marple crossed to the window, her steps light but deliberate, and peered out. Clara knelt by the fire, her hands trembling as she fed another sheet into the flames. The girl's face was pale, her eyes darting toward the manor as if expecting someone to emerge. Miss Marple's heart softened, but only for a moment. Clara was hiding something vital, and Miss Marple's secret weapon, her ability to read the quiet tremors of human guilt, told her the time to act was now. Florence. Miss Marple called softly, turning to her maid, who was polishing a silver candlestick in the corner. "Would you fetch my shawl? I believe a walk in the garden is in order." Florence, a sturdy young woman with a knack for overhearing village whispers, nodded. "Right away, miss. Shall I come with you?" "No, dear," Miss Marple replied, her tone gentle but firm. "I'll manage. But do keep an eye on the front gate. I suspect we may have visitors soon." Florence raised an eyebrow but said nothing, accustomed to her mistress's cryptic ways. Miss Marple slipped on her shawl and stepped into the garden, the gravel path crunching under her sensible shoes. The air was crisp, scented with damp earth and the faint char of Clara's fire. As she approached, Clara started, nearly dropping the remaining papers into the flames. "Miss Marple," Clara stammered, her cheeks flushing, I didn't see you there." "No, I suppose you didn't," Miss Marple said, her voice mild but her eyes keen. "Burning something important, are we?" Clara's hands tightened. Around the papers, her knuckles white, just old receipts, nothing worth keeping. Miss Marple tilted her head, her expression one of polite curiosity, though her mind was anything but idle. "Receipts, you say? You've been quite industrious. With your fires lately, Clara, one might think you're trying to erase something more substantial." Clara's eyes widened, and for a moment, Miss Marple thought she might bolt. But the girl's shoulders slumped, and she sank onto a nearby bench, the papers crumpling in her lap. "You know, don't you?" she whispered. "You always seem to know." Miss Marple sat beside her, folding her hands neatly. "I don't know everything, my dear, but I do know that fear can make us do things we regret. And you're afraid, aren't you? Not for yourself, I think, but for someone else." Clara's lip trembled, and she looked away, toward the smouldering ashes. "It's Eleanor," she said at last, her voice barely audible. "She's been through so much, Ashby. He's not what he seems. He's dangerous, Miss Marple. I burned those letters to protect her, but there's more. There's always more with him." Miss Marple nodded, her face serene but her mind racing. "And these papers?" she prompted, glancing at the bundle in Clara's hands. Clara hesitated, then slowly handed over a singed sheet, its edges blackened but the writing still legible. Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles and studied it. It was a ledger page, much like the ones from the hidden room, but this one listed transactions dated only weeks ago, payments to unfamiliar names. Sums far too large for a village manor's upkeep. At the bottom, in Ashby's precise hand, was a single word, Meridian. "This is important, Clara," Miss Marple said, her tone gentle but firm. "Why didn't you give it to Inspector Harrow?" Clara's eyes filled with tears. "Because I was afraid he'd arrest Eleanor." She didn't know what Ashby's business was at first, but she found out, and he threatened her. He said if she ever spoke, he'd ruin her. I thought if I could destroy the evidence, she'd be safe. Miss Marple patted Clara's hand, her touch warm but her mind cold with calculation. Loyalty, she knew, could be as blinding as greed. Clara's devotion to Eleanor was admirable, but it had led her to destroy what might have been the key to exposing Ashby's fraud. Yet this single page, preserved by chance, was a lifeline. "You've done what you thought was right," she said, "but now you must trust me. This page could save Eleanor, not condemn her." Clara nodded, wiping her eyes. "What will you do with it?" "I'll keep it safe," Miss Marple said, slipping the ledger page into her handbag, "and I'll ensure it reaches the right hands. But Clara, you must promise me something. No more fires. If there's more to tell, come to me first." Clara swallowed hard and nodded again. "I promise." Miss Marple rose, her shawl slipping slightly as she turned toward the manor. "Good. Now, go inside and have some tea. You look as if you need it." As Clara hurried away, Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the dying fire. The ledger page was a breakthrough, but it was only one piece of the puzzle. Gibbs's confession to Inspector Harrow the previous night had confirmed Ashby's role in the break-in attempt, but it hadn't explained the full scope of his schemes. The Meridian Trust, the lockets, Eleanor's disappearance, all were tied to Ashby's greed, and Miss Marple was determined to lay it bare. She returned to the drawing room, where Inspector Harrow awaited, his hat in hand and his face etched with frustration. He was a solid man, competent, but prone to underestimating the subtleties of human nature, flaw Miss Marple had long since learned to work around. "Miss Marple," he greeted, his tone a mix of respect and exasperation. "I've just come from questioning Gibbs again. He's sticking to his story. Ashby paid him to bury that locket and to try breaking into the station. Says he didn't know what was in the safe deposit, only that Ashby was desperate to keep it hidden. And you believe him?" Miss Marple asked, settling back into her chair and picking up her knitting. Harrow shrugged. "He's scared, that much is clear. But he's not the mastermind. Ashby's the one pulling the strings, and Gibbs is just the muscle." Miss Marple's needles clicked rhythmically. "Perhaps, but Gibbs is loyal, Inspector. Loyalty can make a man do foolish things, especially when he believes he's protecting someone powerful." "Have you searched his quarters?" Harrow's brow furrowed. "Not yet. We've been focused on the manor and the lake." "Why?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled behind her spectacles. "Because loyalty leaves traces, my dear Inspector. Gibbs may have kept something, a note, a receipt, something Ashby gave him to ensure his silence. I'd suggest looking in places he feels safe. A loose floorboard, perhaps, or a tin under his bed." Harrow nodded, jotting a note in his pocketbook. "I'll have my men check, but what about you? Found anything new in that sharp mind of yours?" Miss Marple smiled faintly and drew the ledger page from her handbag. "Clara was kind enough to share this. It's a piece of Ashby's financial web, and I suspect it connects to the documents in the safe deposit box. You'll want to compare." Then Harrow's eyes widened as he took the page, scanning the figures. "This is recent. If it matches the bank records, we've got him dead to rights." "Indeed," Miss Marple said, "but we must be careful. Ashby is clever, and clever men don't fall easily. He'll have explanations, excuses. We need more than papers, we need his confession." Harrow leaned forward, his voice low, and, "How do you propose we get that?" Miss Marple's needles paused, and she met his gaze, "By letting him believe he's won. Set a trap, Inspector. Let him think the evidence is slipping through his fingers, and he'll make a mistake. He always does. Harrow considered this, then nodded. I'll have Gibbs released this afternoon. Let Ashby think he's in the clear. Maybe he'll slip up. Miss Marple inclined her head. A wise choice, and I'll keep an eye on Willow. Grange, Clara's not the only one hiding something, I wager. As Harrow left to organize his men, Miss Marple turned her attention to the village beyond the manor's gates. St. Mary Mead was quiet today. The shops shuddered for the afternoon, but the air hummed with anticipation. The charity auction, the threatening note, the buried Locketteach event had stirred the villagers' collective imagination, and Miss Marple knew that gossip, properly directed, could be as powerful as evidence. She resolved to visit Mrs. Ban later, whose knack for spreading news was unmatched. That afternoon, Gibbs was released, his face pale as he shuffled out of the police station. Miss Marple watched from a bench across the street, her knitting in her lap, unnoticed by the villagers passing by. Gibbs glanced over his shoulder, as if expecting pursuit, then hurried toward Willow Grange. Miss Marple's lips curved slightly. He was rattled, and rattled men made mistakes. By evening, she was back at the manor, invited for tea by Mrs. Langley, who had taken to hosting small gatherings to restore the village's spirits. The drawing room was abuzz with chatter, the clink of teacups mingling with murmurs about Ashby's troubles. Miss Marple sat near the fireplace, her eyes scanning the room. Ashby was absent, but Clara was there, her hands twisting nervously. In her lap, Mrs. Langley, resplendent in a violet dress, was recounting her purchase of the antique clock, oblivious to its hidden key. And such a bargain, Mrs. Langley said, her voice carrying. Though I must say, it's been nothing but trouble since Gibbs tried to fix it. Miss Marple's ears pricked up. Trouble, Mrs. Langley? She asked, her tone deceptively casual. Oh yes, Mrs. Langley replied, sipping her tea. The clock stopped ticking the day after the auction. I had to have it looked at, and the repairman said someone had tampered with the mechanism. Quite odd, don't you think? Quite. Miss Marple agreed, her mind racing. Gibbs's tampering wasn't about fixing the clock, it was about retrieving the key. And if Ashby had sent him, it meant the key's importance was greater than she'd realized. As the tea party wound down, Miss Marple slipped into the hall, where Clara was gathering coats. Clara, a word, she said, softly, drawing the girl. Aside, you've been very brave, but there's one more thing I need to know. Did Eleanor ever mention a key? Clara's eyes widened, and she hesitated. She said something once about a key Ashby kept hidden. She didn't know what it opened, only that it was important. Why? Miss Marple patted her arm. You've done well to tell me. Now, go help Mrs. Langley. I'll handle the rest. As Clara returned to the drawing room, Miss Marple slipped the key from her handbag, its brass surface glinting in the lamplight. It was small, unremarkable, but it held the weight of Ashby's secrets. She tucked it away, her mind already planning the next step. The safe deposit box had revealed much, but the key suggested something more, perhaps another hiding place. Another layer to Ashby's deception. That night, Miss Marple sat by her fire, the ledger page and key on the table beside her. The village was quiet, but she knew the calm was fleeting. Ashby was cornered, and cornered men were dangerous. She thought of Eleanor hiding under an assumed name, and Clara burning evidence out of loyalty. She thought of Gibbs, a pawn in Ashby's game, and Harrow, steady but out of his depth. And she thought of the glove left behind in the break-in attempt, a careless mistake that had tightened the net around Ashby, The clock on her mantel struck midnight, and Miss Marple smiled. Faintly. Tomorrow she would set the final trap. She would gather them, Ashby, Clara, Eleanor, Harrow, and lay out the truth, piece by piece, until Ashby had nowhere to hide. Her secret weapon wasn't the key or the ledger page. It was her understanding of human nature, the way greed and fear twisted even the cleverest minds. Ashby would confess, not because he wanted to, but because he would have no choice. She rose, extinguishing the lamp, and glanced out her window at the darkened village. St. Mary Mead was her home, its quirks and secrets as familiar as her own heartbeat, and as long as she was here, no mystery would go unsolved. Chapter 13. The final revelation. The late afternoon sun filtered through the tall, arched windows of Willow Granger's drawing room, casting golden slants across the polished oak floor. The air was thick with anticipation, a charged stillness that seemed to hum beneath the surface, as if the room itself knew secrets were about to unravel. Miss Marple sat primly in a high-backed chair, her knitting needles idle in her lap, her sharp eyes scanning the faces gathered around her. Her small, bird-like frame belied the commanding presence she held, a quiet authority born of countless years observing the intricacies of human nature. Across from her, Ashby stood by the fireplace, his tailored suit immaculate but his posture rigid, betraying a man on the edge of composure. His fingers drummed lightly on the mantelpiece, a nervous tick that Miss Marple noted with a faint tilt of her head. Clara sat near the window, her hands clasped tightly, her face pale as though she hadn't slept in days. Eleanor Price, no longer hiding under an assumed name, occupied a velvet settee, her dark eyes fixed on Ashby with a mixture of defiance and lingering pain. Mrs. Langley, the proud owner of the antique clock, perched on an ottoman, her lips pursed in disapproval, as if the very idea of scandal offended her sensibilities. Inspector Harrow stood near the door, his notebook tucked under his arm, his steady gaze sweeping the room like a lighthouse beam. Miss Marple cleared her throat, a delicate sound that nonetheless drew every eye to her. "Thank you all for coming," she began, her voice soft but clear, carrying the weight of certainty. "I believe it's time we put an end to the shadows that have hung over Willow Granger and St. Mary Mead for far too long." Ashby's fingers stilled on the mantel. "Miss Marple," he said, his tone smooth but edged with impatience, "I'm not sure what you hope to achieve with this gathering. If you have accusations, I'd prefer you make them plainly." "I shall," she replied, her eyes twinkling with a knowing glint. "But truth, Mr. Ashby, is like a good skein of wool. It must be unravelled carefully, lest it tangle further." She reached into her handbag, producing a small stack of papers, their edges slightly singed. The ledger page, recovered from Clara's desperate attempt to burn incriminating evidence, lay on top, its cryptic figures stark against the creamy paper. Beside it, she placed the locket, its silver surface gleaming, engraved with the initials, E.P. Finally, she set down a folder of documents from the London Bank's safe deposit box, their official seals catching the light. "Let us begin with the Meridian Trust," Miss Marple said, her voice steady, "a venture that promised wealth to many in St. Mary, Mead, and beyond, but delivered only ruin. These documents," she tapped the folder, "detailed transactions that funneled funds into accounts controlled by you, Mr. Ashby, while investors, like Eleanor here, lost everything." Ashby's jaw tightened, but he forced a laugh. "Business ventures fail, Miss Marple. It's unfortunate, but hardly criminal. The Meridian Trust was a gamble, and gambles don't always pay off. Eleanor leaned forward, her voice low but fierce. A gamble. You told me it was a sure thing, Leonard. You took my savings, my sister's savings, and left us with nothing. You knew exactly what you were doing. Eleanor Ashby said, his tone softening, almost cajoling. You were always so trusting. I warned you there were risks. You chose to invest. Miss Marple raised a hand, silencing the brewing argument. Let us not dwell on what was said, but what was done. These ledgers, she lifted the singed page, show payments to a certain G.I. Gibbs for services rendered. Services that included burying a locket by the Manners Lake and attempting to break into the police station to retrieve these very documents. Gibbs, who had been conspicuously absent from the gathering, was mentioned with deliberate weight. Inspector Harrow shifted, his eyes narrowing as he glanced at Ashby. Gibbs confessed to both acts, Harrow said, his voice like gravel. He claims he acted on your orders, Mr. Ashby. Preposterous, Ashby snapped, his composure slipping. Gibbs is a disgruntled employee, nothing more. He'd say anything to save himself. Miss Marple tilted her head, studying him. Perhaps, but human nature, Mr. Ashby, is remarkably consistent. A man like Gibbs, loyal, practical, not overly imaginative, does not act without instruction. His nervousness when I found him in the hidden room, his clumsy excuses about repairing shelves. They spoke of a man carrying out orders he didn't fully understand. Clara's hands twisted in her lap, and Miss Marple's gaze softened as it fell on her. Clara, my dear, you've carried a heavy burden. You burned papers to protect Eleanor, didn't you? You feared what Mr. Ashby might do if the truth came out. Clara's eyes widened, her lips trembling. I only wanted to keep her safe. Eleanor's been through so much. When I found those letters, I thought burning them would end it. But one fragment survived, Miss Marple said gently, holding up a charred scrap of paper. A mention of a safe deposit that led me to the bank in London, where I found the documents that confirm Mr. Ashby's fraud. And then there's the locket. She lifted the silver piece, its chain glinting, engraved with E.P. Eleanor. Price, a sentimental trinket, Mr. Ashby called it. But it was more, wasn't it, Clara? Clara's voice was barely a whisper. It was Eleanor's. She gave it to me to hide, to keep it from him. He threatened her, said he'd ruin her if she spoke out. Ashby's face darkened, and he took a step forward. This is slander, Miss Marple. You've woven a story from scraps and supposition. I loved Eleanor once. I would never harm her. Eleanor's hands clenched into fists. Loved me, Italy. Used me, Leonard. You took everything, my money, my trust, my future, and when I tried to leave, you sent this. She reached into her pocket and produced a folded letter, its edges worn but the writing clear. She handed it to Miss Marple, who read it aloud in her calm, measured tone. Keep silent, or you'll regret it. You know what I'm capable of. Signed, L. Ashby. The room fell silent, the weight of the words settling like dust. Mrs. Langley gasped, her hand fluttering to her chest. Good heavens, Mr. Ashby, how could you? Ashby's face was a mask of fury and desperation. That letter proves nothing. It could mean anything, a business dispute, a misunderstanding. You're twisting it to fit your narrative. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed, sharp as a blade. Oh, I don't twist. Mr. Ashby, I observe, and what I observe is a pattern. A hidden room to conceal your ledgers. A locket buried to erase Eleanor's claim. A threatening note to drive Lydia away. and Gibbs, poor loyal Gibbs, caught in your web, doing your bidding out of fear or reward. She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a near whisper, yet it carried the force of a thunderclap. You see, Mr. Ashby, deception is like a poorly knitted sweater, one loose thread, and the whole thing unravels. You underestimated the people of St. Mary Mead. You underestimated Eleanor's courage, Clara's loyalty, and, if I may be so bold, my own curiosity. Ashby's shoulders slumped, the fight draining from him. He sank into a chair, his hands covering his face. It wasn't supposed to be like this, he muttered. The Meridian Trust. It was meant to make us all rich, but the market turned, and I had to protect myself. I never meant for anyone to get hurt. Protect yourself. Elena's voice cracked with anger. You ruined lives, Leonard. You left me with nothing, forced me to hide, to live under a false name, and you call that protection? Harrow stepped forward, his notebook now open. Leonard Ashby, you're under arrest for fraud and coercion. We'll sort out the rest. At the station, as Harrow led Ashby from the room, his cuffs glinting in the fading light, Clara rose and crossed to Eleanor. The two women embraced, tears streaming down their faces. I'm so sorry, Clara whispered. I should have told you sooner. Eleanor shook her head, her voice choked. You kept me safe, Clara. You always did. Mrs. Langley, still clutching, her handbag as if it were a lifeline, stood and addressed Miss Marple. Well, I never thought I'd see such drama in St. Mary Mead. But you've done a fine thing, Miss Marple. That clock of mine caused more trouble than it was worth, but I'm glad it played its part. Miss Marple smiled, her eyes crinkling. Every object has a story, Mrs. Langley, and every story, in the end, finds its truth. As the group dispersed, Miss Marple lingered by the window, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The drawing room, once heavy with secrets, felt lighter. Now, as if the air itself had been cleansed. She tucked her knitting into her bag, her mind already turning to the next day's tea with Mrs. Bantry, where she'd no doubt hear the villagers' take on the scandal. But for now, justice had been served. Ashby's confession had unravelled. The final thread, and St. Mary Mead could breathe again. Miss Marple stepped into the cool evening air, her heart light, her faith in human nature flawed, frail, but capable of redemption. Chapter 14. A village restored. The morning sun spilled over St. Mary Mead, gilding the cobblestone paths and thatched roofs with a warmth that seemed to promise renewal. The village, so recently stirred by the scandal of Ashby's fraud, now hummed, with a quiet resolve to mend itself. Miss Marple, sitting in her armchair by the window, watched a sparrow flit across her garden, its tiny wings catching the light. Her knitting needles clicked softly, a rhythm as steady as her thoughts, which turned, as they often did, to the intricacies of human nature, greed, loyalty, redemption. These were the threads she had unravelled to expose Ashby's deceit, and now, with him in custody, she felt the village knitting itself back together. Stitch by careful stitch, she set her knitting aside and adjusted her spectacles, her sharp eyes catching a glimpse of Florence, her maid, bustling in with a tray of tea. Goodness, Florence, Miss Marple said, her voice gentle but laced with amusement. You're moving as if the vicar's coming for lunch. Florence, her cheeks flushed, set the tray down with a clatter. Oh, Miss Marple, it's just. The village is all aflutter today. Mrs. Langley's hosting that tea this afternoon, and everyone's talking about it. They say she's got her brooch back, and she's acting like she's the queen herself, inviting half the village to Willow Grange to make peace. Miss Marple's lips twitched into a smile. Mrs. Langley does have a flair for the dramatic, but it's good of her, I think, to try and mend things. A village thrives on trust, not just gossip. Florence nodded, pouring tea with a practiced hand. And there's talk of Miss Eleanor and Miss Clara starting something new, a bookshop, they say, with the money Inspector Harrow's trying to recover from that Meridian Trust business. Imagine that, a bookshop in St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. A bookshop, indeed. A place for stories to live, and perhaps for truths to be uncovered, quietly, between the pages. She took a sip of tea, her mind already turning to the day ahead. She would visit Eleanor and Clara, she decided, to see how they were faring. And then, of course, there was Mrs. Langley's Tian event that promised more than just scones and civility. The walk to Eleanor and Clara's cottage was a pleasant one, the air crisp with the scent of autumn leaves. Miss Marple, in her sensible tweed coat and sturdy shoes, moved with a sprightliness that belied her age. The village was alive with small, hopeful signs. Mr. Grayson, the baker, waved cheerfully as he set out a tray of fresh rolls. Young Tom Carter, the boy who'd spotted Gibbs digging by the lake, darted past with a grin, no longer burdened by the weight of secrets. Even the church bells seemed to ring with a brighter note, as if echoing the village's relief. Eleanor and Clara's cottage, tucked behind a hedge of late-blooming roses, was a picture of modest charm. The door opened before Miss Marple could knock, and Eleanor stood there, her face softer than it had been in weeks, though her eyes still carried the shadow of past fears. "Miss Marple," she said warmly, stepping aside, "please, come in. Clara's just putting the kettle on." Inside, the cottage was cozy, with a fire crackling in the hearth and the faint smell of lavender lingering in the air. Clara emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on an apron, her expression a mix of gratitude and lingering guilt. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice catching slightly, "we owe you so much. If you hadn't seen through Ashby's lies..." Miss Marple waved a hand dismissively, settling into a cushioned chair. "Nonsense, Clara. You and Eleanor did the brave thing, keeping those truths safe until they could be told. Now, tell me about this bookshop of yours." Eleanor's face lit up, and she gestured to a small table where sketches and notes were scattered. "We've been planning it all week. With the funds Inspector Harrow's working to recover, we think we can turn the old miller's shop on High Street into something special. Books, of course, but also a place for people to gather, to talk, to feel safe." Clara nodded, her hands twisting in her apron. "It's for Eleanor, really. After everything Ashby took from her savings, her trust, we want to build something that lasts, something good." Miss Marple's eyes softened. "And you will. A bookshop is a fine legacy. People will come for the stories, but they'll stay for the kindness you show them. You've both learned how to protect what matters." Eleanor reached for Clara's hand, squeezing it gently. "We've learned from you, Miss Marple. You saw what we couldn't, what Ashby was, what he'd done, and you gave us the courage to face it." Miss Marple shook her head, her smile wry. "Oh, my dear, I only pointed out what was already there. People's natures reveal themselves, if you watch closely enough. Now, tell me, will you have a corner for detective novels? I'm rather partial to them myself." The sisters laughed, the sound light and unburdened, and Miss Marple felt a quiet satisfaction settle in her chest. This was the true work of Justice, not just the arrest of a wrongdoer, but the restoration of hope, the mending of lives torn apart. Mrs. Langley's tea at Willow Grange was, as expected, a grand affair. The manor's drawing-room was adorned with vases of late roses and polished silver, and the long table groaned under the weight of sandwiches, scones, and a towering Victoria sponge. Mrs. Langley herself, resplendent in a peacock blue dress, and her recovered brooch pinned proudly to her chest, greeted each guest with a magnanimous smile, as if she alone had orchestrated the village's return to harmony. Miss Marple, seated near the window with a cup of Earl Grey, observed the room with her usual quiet vigilance. The vicar was deep in conversation with Mr. Grayson about the church roof fund. Young Tom Carter's mother fussed over his tie, much to his embarrassment, and Mrs. Bantry, ever the social butterfly, flitted between groups, her laughter ringing out like a bell. But Miss Marple's attention lingered on the absences Gibbs, now in custody, and Ashby, whose shadow still loomed over the manor, though his presence was gone. Mrs. Langley approached, her brooch glinting in the afternoon light. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice warm but carrying a hint of performance, "I must thank you again for ensuring my brooch was returned. I told Inspector Harrow it was the least he could do, after all the trouble." Miss Marple inclined her head, her expression serene. "It was no trouble, Mrs. Langley. The brooch belongs with you, just as peace belongs in this village." Mrs. Langley's smile faltered, just for a moment, as if she sensed the gentle weight of Miss Marple's words. "Well," she said, recovering quickly, "I hope this tea shows everyone we're moving forward. No more secrets, no more scandals." "Indeed," Miss Marple murmured, her eyes drifting to the window, where the manor's gardens stretched toward the lake. She thought of the locket buried there, of Eleanor's courage, of Clara's loyalty. Secrets had a way of resurfacing, she knew, but so did kindness, if given the chance. As the tea progressed, Miss Marple found herself drawn into a conversation with Mrs. Bantry, who was brimming with theories about the village's next chapter. "I heard Eleanor and Clara are naming the bookshop Price and Promise," Mrs. Bantry said, her eyes sparkling. "Isn't that lovely? And they're planning to host a reading group. I might even join, though I'm terrible at finishing books." Miss Marple chuckled. "You'll find the time, darling. A bookshop will do wonders for St. Mary Mead. It's a place for new beginnings, and we could all use a few of those." Mrs. Bantry leaned closer, lowering her voice. "And what about you, Jane? Surely you're not done poking into mysteries. I saw you watching that young couple outside Earlier Trouble in Paradise, do you think?" Miss Marple's eyes crinkled with amusement. "Oh, Dolly, not every argument is a mystery. Sometimes a quarrel is just a quarrel, and love sorts it out in the end. Let's leave them to it." Mrs. Bantry laughed, but her gaze followed Miss Marple's to the window, where the young couple Mary, Ellis, and Peter Wells, by the look of it, stood by the garden gate. Mary's hands were on her hips, her voice sharp, while Peter gestured helplessly, his face flushed. Miss Marple watched them for a moment, her mind cataloguing their postures, their expressions. A lover's spat, she decided, likely over something trivial, a missed appointment, a careless word. No need for her to intervene. Some stories resolved themselves without her knitting needles. As the afternoon waned, Miss Marple slipped away from the tea, her steps carrying her back to her cottage. The village was quiet now, the golden light softening the edges of the world. She paused by the churchyard, where the gravestones stood like silent sentinels, and thought of Eleanor's sisterly bond with Clara, of Mrs. Langley's reclaimed pride, of Inspector Harrow's steady pursuit of justice. Each had played their part, and she had simply woven their threads together. Back in her sitting room, Miss Marple settled into her armchair, her knitting in her lap. The fire crackled, casting shadows that danced across the walls, and she sipped her tea, the warmth spreading through her. She thought of Ashby, his greed laid bare, and of Gibbs, whose loyalty had been his undoing. She thought of the locket, the ledger page, the key small objects that had carried such weight. But most of all, she thought of St. Mary Mead, its heart beating strong beneath the surface of its quiet lanes and tidy gardens outside. The village settled into evening, the lights in the cottages glowing like stars against the dusk. Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the window where the young couple had been earlier. They were gone now, perhaps reconciled, perhaps not. She smiled, her fingers working the needles with practiced ease. Some mysteries, she knew, were best left to life itself, and so, with the click of her needles and the warmth of her tea, Miss Marple let the day slip away, content in the knowledge that St. Mary Mead was whole again, its charm enduring, its stories safe in her care.